Good morning, everybody. It's very, very nice to see a full house like this in this lovely autumn morning. EVA is an academy for engineering and economics, and we are promoting those sciences, and we are also promoting industrial development, and we have done that almost exactly 100 years now, so it's about 3 weeks till our 100th anniversary, or our birthday, if you like. Axel F. Enström, who founded EVA for 100 years ago, he was always talking very warmly about the importance of engineering and also economic development and research when he was starting EVA. And I think that we have been, for 100 years, we have been true to his vision of what an engineering and economic academy could do for the society. And so we have been doing a lot of different kinds of things, which have had quite a big difference in Swedish, particularly the industrial development, for instance, starting different kinds of research institutes, which of course nowadays are independent institutions, but they started in EVA's domain. We have also had in the times when we didn't have internet, we were actually having also technical attaches that we sent out to the world to find out, what other countries are doing, kind of benchmarking, things like that. We have also been looking into spreading this engineering and economic information, also for kids. So we have started the Technical Museum, which is still going strong in Sweden. So go and have a look at their exhibitions if you have the time. So to celebrate our 100th anniversary, each of our 12 departments have organized these celebratory seminars, and today it is the time for the Department for Economics to do this, and I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker, and I give the word to Anders Lindberg, who is the chair of that department, and welcome everybody.
Thank you very much, and on behalf of the Economic Department, welcome to this Jubilee seminar with the title in English, Economic Policy in the Era of Intense Technological Change, which implies that it was more easier to do economic policy before we had this, wasn't it? Or perhaps not. And it is a theme that has gathered many to come here today, and we look forward to this seminar, and I welcome to the stage Cecilia Hermansson and Johan Schück, the moderators. The show can begin.
So, welcome everyone. We're very happy to have you here and to talk about this very exciting topic about technological change and economic policy. I wanted to introduce my co-moderator, Johan Schück. He was previously a journalist in the daily newspapers Dagens Nyheter, covering economics and economic policy. Today he's a freelance writer, has his own blog covering basically the same topics.
Thank you, and I would like to introduce my co-moderator Cecilia Hermansson, who previously was chief economist at Swedbank, and nowadays is a researcher at KTH, specialized in banking and finance.
Thank you. So, we are going to have our keynote speaker, Professor Danny Roderick, within a few seconds here on stage. After that, there will be 3 panels with a break at 10:30. You will be able to raise questions at the end of each panel and also at the end of the seminar, when we also welcome Professor Roderick up again on the stage. So, welcome now, and Johan will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. Yes, Danny Roderick is an outstanding and well-known economist. He covers a broad field of important research topics, such as globalization, economic development, and political economy. Professor Roderick finds globalization, open trade, and technological change beneficial for nations' well-being, but he also thinks that it challenges the outlook for groups of individuals. Thus, economic policy needs to be active and accommodative to take increased income inequality into account. Professor Roderick is presently the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Also, he is currently President-elect of the International Economic Association. His newest book, issued in 2017, is Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. You can find it in the bookshops in Stockholm as well. Before that, he wrote the books Economic Rules, The Rights and Wrongs of the Dismal Science, and The Globalization Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy. However, his public breakthrough came already more than 20 years ago when he published the book with a forward-looking title, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? With a question mark after that. His personal background is being born and raised in Istanbul in Turkey, where his ancestors came long ago as Sephardic Jews. His academic education has been in the US, but he still keeps ties with his native country, strongly opposing the Turkish authoritarian rule. As you certainly realize, Danny Rodrik is not afraid to take standpoints that could make him controversial in the public debate. But he does so from an independent position and based on an excellent economic analysis. For these reasons, we are very happy to have him here as our keynote speaker at this Jubilee conference. Please, Professor Rodrik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Cecilia, for the invitation. Let me add my congratulations to Eva for the 100th birthday. It's really a great pleasure to be here to discuss this morning this extremely important topic of technological change and what it can do for and to our societies. I think it is the issue of our time. Our discussion naturally, I think, has to be carried out against the backdrop of what is the most notable political trend of our time, which is the rise of populism, in particular the rise of far-right populism, of course, which this country is quite familiar with. There are two broad perspectives on why this political upheaval is happening, and mainstream or centrist political parties are losing ground to the far right in particular. One of it is based on the idea of cultural differences or cultural divides in society, that large segments of society have become nativist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and these are based on sort of cultural values and identities, and that's what the far right exploits. The second perspective is much more about economic anxieties that changes and transformations in the labor market have fostered. And these are associated with changes in globalization and technology, our focus today. I'm very much, just to put my cards on the table, I'm very much in the second camp. People are what they are. They have their identities, they have their prejudices, and I think all of us have sort of latent cultural values and differences that sometimes can be exploited for one end to the other. But I think really the big change of the last 20 years or so is what has happened in labor markets, what has happened in our economic context. And I think these economic changes have made it much more conducive, have opened up the field for non-mainstream political groups and political parties to exploit some of these latent divisions and fissures in society. So I see our main challenge as we go forward, and in particular as we think about the role of technology, is how we're going to be handling many of the complicated impacts that technology is going to produce on labor markets and on economic anxieties in large segments of the workforce. And I think that's really really the only way we can restore some sanity to our politics. My talk is going to focus on some of the policy implications of that. We know that economically the world has gone through an upheaval. It has provided largely sort of a complex pattern of impacts on people in different parts of the global income distribution. We know that the top 1% has done extremely well, and that's mostly the very wealthy in the advanced countries. They have captured, the global 1% have captured 27% of the total growth in this 35-year, nearly 4 decades of economic performance. The bottom 90% of the population or the workforce in the advanced countries have been, as this chart suggests, have been squeezed in between, and they've received very, very few of the gains. And if we want to understand this populist backlash, I think that is not a very bad place to start from. Now, technology is part of this transformation, and I think our discussion of technology today goes back and forth between two camps, which we might call the techno-optimists and techno-pessimists. The techno-optimists believe that the fourth industrial revolution is moving us into a completely different, a newly revolutionary era of technological progress, that this will encompass very large segments of the economy, and the benefits will eventually be shared to provide a overall broad and inclusive prosperity. The techno-pessimists are in turn, I think, divided into two subgroups. One that suggests that, in fact, much of this new advances in automation, in biotech, and digital technologies, robotics, are going to be bottled up, are going to remain isolated in some vanguard sectors, in some champions, and that they will not broadly disseminate. And alternatively, and this is the second sub-camp, even if some of these broader gains are realized for the economy as a whole, that it will create a very segmented labor force that will show up either in joblessness or very unequal labor market outcomes, very unequal distribution of wages. I think so far, unfortunately, we're perhaps only at the beginning of this stage, but I think it's fair to say that so far the empirical evidence that we have suggests that we have perhaps to be on the pessimists' camp. On the one hand, when we look at overall productivity advances in the economy, even though these new technologies are obviously all around us, digital technologies and biotech and everything we hear about and which you contribute to making happen, the overall economy-wide productivity growth has been very disappointing. Here, two charts on total factor productivity and labor productivity. And what we see there that in recent years, this is in the United States, the rate of growth of productivity has actually slowed down significantly compared to an earlier period, which is puzzling in light of these strong claims that are being made on behalf of the fourth industrial revolution. Part of this slowing down of the overall rate of productivity growth is that the distribution of the benefits of these new technologies seem to be very uneven. In particular, there is a large gap that's being opened up by what this chart calls frontier firms, the firms that are highly capable and are absorbing new technologies, and the non-frontier firms that are lagging behind in terms of productivity performance. So what is essentially seems to be happening is that these new technologies are really helping these firms at the very frontier, but essentially there is a lack of dissemination, that these new technologies aren't being disseminated to a larger group of firms. You can see that in manufacturing, all firms, frontier firms, have been increasing labor productivity at a rate of 3.5%, while the rest is something like half of that. The gap is even larger in services, where frontier firms have experienced productivity growth of 5% per annum, whereas non-frontier firms are actually declining in terms of productivity growth. So this is the gap that is opening up across firms. There's, of course, also a gap that's opening up in terms of the distribution of the benefits of technological and productivity growth across different claimants to income, in particular between workers and non-workers. So if we look at the gap that has opened up since roughly the late 1970s between the overall productivity and the compensation to production workers, that's the non-managerial, non-supervisory workers, that's really quite striking. That typically wages have tended to proceed alongside productivity, but really since the early 1980s, this is no longer the case. That is to say that the main beneficiaries of these productivity changes are managerial professional and rentiers and capital owners. Alongside these changes, we have the important phenomenon that is now being called the polarization of the labor market, and that is the trend about what's happening to demand for labor or employment rates in different segments of the labor market. So if we disaggregate types of workers or types of labor from the lowest skilled to the highest skilled. So from the lowest skilled being people who provide personal services to the highest skilled, the professionals and the managers. What you can see there is that employment has increased at the two ends of the skill distribution. There is increased demand for professionals, for technicians, for managers. There's increased demand for people who provide personal and health services. But where employment has collapsed is really in this middle part of the skill distribution for production workers, for clerical workers, for administrative workers. And this is traditionally where the good jobs in an advanced economy have come from. So we have this simultaneous fact of demand for good jobs collapsing and the overall compensation of most of the workers actually going down relative to what's happening in the rest of the economy. Behind these trends in the labor market are two things that are deeply entangled. There is, of course, changes in technology, the trends towards automation, the fact that technology is increasingly skill-biased and therefore helps most those workers with the skills and the capabilities and the professionals and the skilled managers. But there are also sort of these trends in terms of economic globalization, the fact that the integration of world markets in trade have pushed a lot of workers into more precarious, lower compensation jobs. Scale economies and winner-take-all markets mean that incomes tend to be concentrated among the winners. Financial crises and the subsequent policies of austerity have simply added and magnified on these labor market trends. Now, how do we think about technology and globalization and the relationship between those two? Formally, as economists like to say, there's actually no difference between trade and technological progress, that there is a formal equivalence between these two as sources of productivity change in an economy. That is, a firm can increase its productivity either by outsourcing some of its inputs to lower cost suppliers from the rest of the world, or simply by investing and reaping the benefits of improved process technologies. These are formally identical processes. In fact, when we go to some of the earliest explanations of the benefits of the gains from trade, and here I have an example from 1701, even before, way before David Ricardo outlined his theory of comparative advantage. The explanation of the gains from trade was in terms of its analogy to productivity or technological change. And Henry Martin here is one of the early proponents of opening up the British economy to trade, an opponent of mercantilists who wanted protection. And the argument of Henry Martin was essentially, look, you know, you wouldn't reject the use of a sawmill because using a sawmill, you can do the job of 3 people with just a sawmill. Why do you reject the use of imports from India that essentially do the same, which is that they bring in these imports, essentially save us the use of more labor. But of course, that example in itself, the fact that you can economize on the use of labor, either through improved technology or through outsourcing, puts at the front of our attention, once again, the question of what happens to the labor that is actually displaced through these new technological methods or through globalization. Now, I think the reason that I bring out globalization in this context and its formal similarity to productivity change or technological change is that so far, in terms of the populist reaction or the populist backlash, we know that it has been mostly globalization that has borne the brunt of this populist backlash. Recently, a colleague and I did a survey among a very large group of people, and we basically asked them to tell us how do you think the government should respond when a factory was threatened by a number of different types of shocks. So we asked them, you know, suppose that the factory is about to close because of technological change, that there are sort of, you know, automation, or that the factory is about to change because of outsourcing, that these workers might be losing their jobs because of outsourcing. And what comes out very clearly and what actually tracks our current political developments is that we've had a very strong reaction against trade and outsourcing. That when we ask people what should the government do if this factory is about to close because the owners are outsourcing production to France or to Cambodia, there is a very strong protectionist reaction against that. The reaction is not nearly as large when the shock takes the form of automation or technological change. So far, we have had a relatively benign public response to technological change. But the question is whether that is going to last. And my worry is that this may not be an ongoing situation, that a kind of a backlash against technology is certainly not out of the question. And we can go back to the first industrial revolution and the introduction of new textile technologies, cotton textile technologies during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And of course, you know, that's when we had a very large-scale public reaction to these new technologies. The picture you have here is the so-called machine breakers, the workers who are engaged in large-scale sabotage of industrial technologies because they thought that these new technologies were taking the jobs of craftsmen, of workers. And these machine breakers, and in England they were called the Luddites, had to be put down through very violent military and police action on the part of the British state. So they didn't just disappear on their own account. And if something like this is going to be to reappear, we can only guess at what the social and political consequences of this anti-technology sentiment might be. So that historical note, I think, is important for us to bear in mind when we consider whether this benign environment for technological change is going to remain or not. Now, that raises the question of what is it that we can do to make sure that technology and technological change can become compatible with social and political stability and with broad gains and inclusive societies. Here, of course, government policy is going to have to play a very big role in partnership and alliance with other sectors of society, with the producers of technology as well as the users of technology, firms and entrepreneurs. We know that policies make a huge difference. So just going backward, looking at the difference that in terms of the distributional outcomes in the United States on the one hand and in Western Europe, that these rather similar trends in technology and globalization have had, we can see that these shocks have been mediated through very different labor market institutions and very different government policies in these two regions. So in the United States, we have had a very sharp change and deterioration in income distribution. So the top 1%, the share of the top 1% in total national income has doubled. The bottom 50% share in national income has nearly halved. When we look at Western Europe, we see somewhat of an income deterioration as well. But as you can see, it's nowhere nearly as rapid or as sharp as in the case of the United States. The background shocks in technology and globalization have been similar, but of course the difference is the policy context. The difference is the nature of labor market institutions, and that these have made a very big difference. The trouble here is that many of those institutions that have cushioned labor markets in Western Europe have either frayed or are now going to be inadequate when we face these new and much more intensive technological changes. So I think, and this is really one of the key messages that I want to give you this morning, I think our policies trying to handle the stresses, societal stresses that new technologies will create, will need to go beyond traditional approaches. So what are those traditional approaches that were in turn reflected in those heterogeneous outcomes between Europe and the United States? We might summarize them under two headings, and these were either pre-production policies or post-production policies. These were policies and institutions that affected the preparation of workers before they came into the labor markets, or policies that affected the distribution of income after production and investment took place. In other words, these were things like education, skills, training, access to finance on the one hand, and on the other, the redistributive taxation of income and sometimes wealth, the use of social transfers and social insurance. But for the most part, these traditional policies, including some of the new policies today on the agenda, such as universal basic income, do not target where I think inequality is created in the first place, where opportunities and inclusion is created in the first place. And that's, of course, at the stage of production. So I think what we need to do is think much harder about how we can target the process of innovation, investment, and production, the production stage of the economy. And I think the broad set of policies that this covers under this rubric are what one might call sort of productivist policies. And this is a range of different types of policies. Obviously, a kind of industrial policies, innovation policies, place-based policies, or what used to be called regional policies, policies with respect to labor markets, competition policy, things like employment guarantees that are now being discussed in the United States. And I want to expand on this, particularly from the perspective of industrial policies, because I think a new type of industrial policies will have to play an important role as part of this complex of productivist policies. And I put these industrial policies in quotation marks because it's very different from the traditional kind of industrial policies that we think of when the term is mentioned. The traditional type of industrial policy associated with the East Asian successful cases, or occasionally in some of the European cases like the French case, is really a kind of a top-down system of incentives on the part of the government that combines a list of sectoral priorities with a list of incentives, and I think that presume a lot of knowledge and bureaucratic capacity on the part of the government, and in many ways, it presumes that a lot of the answers are already known. That we need to subsidize aeronautics, and the way to subsidize is through credit subsidies, and that becomes part of your industrial policy. The new or the modern industrial policy is very different, and it's more a kind of a meta regime for identifying what works and where the problems are and what the solutions might be. So it does not presume that we have a full knowledge of where these market failures or opportunities arise. It's much more concerned about putting in place a process of institutionalized collaboration and dialogue between the government and its various agencies and the private sectors. And it focuses on identifying constraints and opportunities and the generation of private-public solutions. It is based on an iterative process of monitoring and evaluation and revision of policies as new facts are uncovered with respect to opportunities and bottlenecks and what can be done to relieve them. It does not presume omniscience or competence on the part of the government. It simply believes that can be developed over time, and these kinds of features are actually characteristic of many initiatives that exist currently around the world that are not otherwise actually linked. So I have here a very wide range of examples, some of them from the United States, others actually from some middle-income countries, where some of these practices are actually in operation. So in the United States, where many people presume that there's a lot of hostility against industrial policy, it turns out, of course, that much of the new technologies, frontier technologies in the United States, are the product of very purposeful industrial policies. Both the DARPA, the defense-related technologies, and the ARPA-E, green technologies, are essentially attempts by government agencies to develop frontier technologies through this iterative, collaborative process of interaction with innovators, with firms, with technology centers, with universities, all based on this notion that in fact we have little knowledge to start with. We identify some priorities and we develop them over time through this process of strategic collaboration. There's a similar effort going on set up under the Obama administration called the Manufacturing Institutes. But very similar approaches are in place in a range of countries, even in a country that is otherwise an exemplar of economic failure, such as Argentina. When you look behind the the surface and scratch the surface, you find that some areas which have had very significant productivity growth, such as modern agriculture, precision agriculture, behind those advances has been a similar kind of private-public collaboration based through various state agencies and working with entrepreneurs and with companies in a very kind of a similar type of fashion. These new approaches to industrial policy are essentially, we can summarize them under sort of, having four different but complementary design principles that go in making them work. The first one, which I call here embeddedness, is the idea that the government starts with relative agnosticism and relative sort of lack of omniscience, and recognizes that the needed knowledge about the existence or the magnitudes of the market failures that need to be, or the network failures that need to be identified and fixed, the knowledge does not exist necessarily ex ante within the government, that they actually exist within the firm, so that the government needs to be embedded. The state agencies need to be embedded in these processes to find where these problems are. And this is very different from the traditional way in which economists think about public policy, which is based on this sort of arm's length notion that you keep the private sector at bay, you simply establish the ground rules and your incentive systems, but otherwise don't interact deeply with the private sector. The shortcoming of this approach, of that traditional approach of regulation in this context, is that it really wastes an opportunity for information discovery. That traditional model of regulation does not provide the means through which government agencies can find out and learn about what's actually happening in the private sector. The second key design element is directly targeting this high dimensional uncertainty that exists either in high technology areas or other areas where there is intense uncertainty. And that's this notion that this collaboration has to be iterative, that experimentation has to be a very big part of it because you don't know exactly what's going to work. And precisely because of that, you need to complement experimentation with ongoing monitoring and policy revision as you find out more about what works and what doesn't. Third, they need to have disciplines in this relationship because you want the government to be embedded in the private sector, but you don't want the government to be in bed with the private sector. And so that you need to discipline this relationship, and that's where sort of carrots and sticks become important. In other words, that the private sector has to undertake commitments in return for the direct or indirect assistance that the public sector provides. And fourth, of course, the principle of accountability, that in democracies we need to figure out how to make this collaboration work in a way that's actually transparent and open and provides accountability for society at large. So this distinction between the traditional and modern, which I've summarized here under sort of various dimensions, I think is key to understanding why when we talk about these new productivist policies, they're going to look very different from the traditional understanding of industrial policy. And for lack of a better word, I continue with that word industrial policy, but I want to emphasize the differences. The important issue, the important questions when we're thinking about industrial policy is what should we explicitly target? And I think here is, in some sense, my second key message that I want to make, is that traditionally industrial policy has targeted innovation and competitiveness and productivity directly. And I think in this economy, I think our priorities have to change to something else. And that something else is what I've called here good jobs. Good jobs are loosely jobs that provide subsistence, that enables at least a middle-class existence, and with the usual kinds of protections. So I think every society understands what is meant by a good job, although in practice you'd have to be very clear to be able to quantify it. But I think it's extremely important that for these new sets of policies to be targeting directly good jobs rather than innovation per se. It's quite striking to me when you look across countries into their sort of agencies that promote innovation, how in fact this priority is not actually on the table at the present. And of course, targeting good jobs is going to mean both increasing the skill level and the qualitative nature of the jobs that already exist. It means increasing the number of good jobs by supporting startups, SMEs, but also by attracting new investment from outsiders. And it's going to entail what's called active labor market policies that are already familiar to. I think except for the third is relatively well known, and these active labor market policies or workforce development policies are part of the arsenal of policy in a lot of advanced countries. But I would say that the first two are relatively weakly developed, and that's where a lot of new work needs to be done. The quid pro quo for a good job strategy is essentially based on the understanding that the firms and the government both need something from each other. Firms need access to the ecosystem that's going to provide them with the ability to innovate. That means having access to a stable, skilled workforce, but also reliable horizontal and vertical networks of other firms that provide complementary services and complementary inputs, and a reliable system of enforcement of formal and informal property rights and contractual relationships. Many of these things actually have the nature of collective action problems, and therefore firms need the coordination power that government or its agencies have to fill out these networks. On the other hand, governments needs the firms to internalize the social cost of the relative scarcity of good jobs, because we know that absence of good jobs is correlated with all the bad things that are causing our politics to suffer today. Everything from broken families, drug addiction, criminality, to political polarization and the rise of populist parties, and most damagingly, the creeping rise of authoritarian values in parts of the labor force that are losing access to these good jobs. I think that's going to require these new mental frames, both on the part of the government, but also on the part of business elites. I think I put this rather starkly. It's a transition from hyper-globalism to social solidarity, which is to say that firms, I think, have to move away from thinking of themselves as essentially footloose entities that have access to a global workforce, a global set of suppliers, and part of global value chains. That's, of course, important for productivity. But that system cannot last if the domestic infrastructure that sustains this global integration is frayed and disappears because of domestic divisions in society. So therefore, I think firms will have to exhibit a much greater degree of social solidarity by engaging actively in what I've called this quid pro quo, by providing the investment in their local communities, in their local suppliers, and in their local workforce. So let me just conclude, having gone through last few bits rather quickly because I was running out of time. The story of our last 2 or 3 decades is that both technological change and globalization have produced domestic economic and social disintegration. As they have integrated the world economy, as the best and the brightest and the most productive have integrated with each other, these groups and these firms have become disintegrated from their own societies. So that's the key divide, I think, that's driving the politics of today. And I think reconstructing healthy societies and polities will necessarily require a process of reintegrating our domestic economies and polities. And I think the key issue there is going to be through this generation of good jobs and a renewed focus on those good jobs. And these new policies will make a very large demand on the private sector. And I think we'll need to be pragmatic, since we know very little about the specific policies that are going to work in different contexts. I think we'll need to be pragmatic and open-minded about experimentation on the part of the government to see what's going to work or not. And occasionally, this experimentation will take the form of what we might think as being economic populism, as policies that seem economically populistic in the sense of trying to reach this mass of workers and providing jobs for them. I urge us to show a certain degree of open-mindedness to such efforts, and I think that a certain dose of economic populism may well be required to forestall what is the much more dangerous form of populism, which is the political populism that breeds and supports far-right extremism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Roderick.
Shall I stay here?
You can
Yes,
stay there because we have a couple of questions with very short answers because time is limited. But the first question that comes to my mind, listening to this, it's very interesting with these new types of industrial policy and the collaboration. But it also means that governments must be very skilled in understanding how globalized companies and how they work and how the society, I mean, how do you see the need for competence of governments in order to do this? And Johan, you had also a question.
Can I take this one first?
Or we just raise both
okay,
of them.
right.
Yeah, because, well, from a Swedish perspective, we are a country with, which is very dependent on foreign trade and open markets. And when you talk about being more domestic, I wonder how that could go together then with our situation. Or do you rather think of this on a European level than a national level in Europe?
Yes, I think those are great questions. First, on the demands on government and the issue of competence and knowledge. I mean, there's a sense in which it puts more. This new approach puts more of a demand on the government. There's a sense in which it puts less of a demand. The sense in which I think it puts more of a demand is that it does require an overall strategy. That sort of internalizing the set of priorities and objectives that this approach entails, and a willingness to extend it through its various agencies, because this is something that cannot be just done at the national level. It has to be extended through regional and municipal levels as well. So that requires a strategy. But I think a big advantage of this newer approach is that it doesn't actually require a lot of ex ante competence and capacity, because it presumes that much of this can be built over time rather than be taken as a given. In fact, this is one of the strengths of this approach, because it doesn't presume that you start out, let's say, with a lot of trust on the part of the business sector. No, it says you start out by talking and figuring out common problems, and the trust develops over time as a result of this interaction. It doesn't presume that the government will know exactly where the problem to fix it. Is precisely that you're going to be discovering over time. So it's in that sense, it actually makes less of a demand on government competence. But you need to be willing to engage in this, and also understand that this is a process that's going to require failure somewhere, because as all experiments require. So you need a political strategy to explain in a democracy that this is how you have to evaluate this in a way, to think in finance terms, as a portfolio of activities, and not get fixated on in individual projects and their success. I think the question of how much of this can be done in a relatively small country on its own. I think clearly in the European context, it would be far better if this could be done on a European context, because that provides a much bigger all the benefits of scale and so forth. But frankly, to be after the experience of the European Union in the last 2 decades, I wouldn't want to sort of take refuge in expectation that the European Commission would be able to produce these kinds of frameworks. And I think a lot will have to be done on the part of individual nations. And I think Sweden is an economy where businesses have a lot of experience of having, on the one hand, grown global, hyper-competitive firms, but these firms that have had the benefit of relying on sort of extensive public support in terms of welfare systems, relatively high tax environment, and so forth. And I think what we need is a state that's going to be sort of at the margin more nimble, and it's going to rely less on redistributive taxation and social supports in providing support for the workforce, but more in this kind of directly productivist exchanges with the governments, where firms do not give up their global links, but they understand that in the end, they do have a home, and all the legal, contractual, property rights enforcement that is required for their operation, and the protection of their interests is provided by their national governments, so that they also have social and national duties that they have to carry out.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Give me applause. So, please have a seat, and we will now ask our panelists coming up. While they come up on stage, we will read some introductions. We have here Lars Calmfors. He's a professor emeritus of international economics at Stockholm University, with an orientation to macroeconomics and labor economics. He's been the chairman of the Swedish Government Commission on the EMU, chairman of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, and also of the Swedish Labour Market Council.
Yes, and I would like to introduce Carolina Ekholm, who is a professor of economics at Stockholm University, specialized in international economics and globalization. She's also been a policymaker as a deputy governor of the Riksbank and a member of its board from 2009 to 2014. And after that, a state secretary in the Ministry of Finance from 2014 to 2018.
And Pontus Braunehjelm, welcome, is a professor of international business and entrepreneurship at KTH. He's also a research director at the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and has been Secretary General to the Globalization Council and chair of the Governmental Entrepreneurship Investigation. So welcome, all three of you. We will now have a conversation with you. We will start with a few questions where we want to follow up first on the talk that Professor Roderick gave. And I want to start with you, Lars. When you hear this talk about industrial policy and good jobs, and how does that sound in a Swedish context for you?
Yes, it's not so easy to comment because you covered a lot of ground. I think you did a very good analysis of the US. Though perhaps it's not that applicable, or everything is not that applicable to Sweden. I don't see these problems with jobs coming up to that large extent in Sweden. I see two main problems. One problem is it's the general problem, of course, of employment of low-skilled workers, low-skilled employees. But in Sweden, that is mainly related to immigration. I mean, that is the problem when it comes to employment. But I also see a kind of dual labor market problem. I see huge labor shortages already now, but developing over time in welfare services, mainly government-financed welfare services. To a large extent, it depends upon aging. So, I mean, we have huge shortages in when it comes to teachers, nurses, police, people in defense also. So I see this dual problem, and not primarily in Sweden related to technological developments. I would rather see them as something that could help us. I mean, using digitalization, robots, and so on, that could alleviate the shortages of labor in welfare services. So I see that as a blessing rather than as a problem. So I think the picture in Sweden is somewhat different. I don't see in front of me any Luddites that are going to destroy computers and robots and so on. I don't think that we don't have that risk in Sweden. We have many other risks, but not that.
Could I go further to Carolina then and ask on the same topic, with your experience from government, do you think there is a capacity at the moment to deal with industrial policy in the way that Danny Roderick is talking about? Or is there something else needed that we don't have yet?
Well, I think there are elements in Swedish industrial policy that bear similarities to what Professor Roderick is talking about. So we have, for instance, a National Innovation Council. I think that's that kind of example headed by the Prime Minister and with dialogue and a focus on trying to facilitate innovation. There are, of course, we have these entities such as ALMI providing capital and advice for small firms and so forth. So there are certain elements, but I think as you noted, in our case, industrial policy is very much framed within EU rules and regulations. So whatever we do is very much bound by EU state aid rules, competition policy rules, and so forth. And there, of course, there are clear limitations. So I think for us, having perhaps a tradition of being a little bit of a corporatist society, I think we have been restricted in what we can do, and perhaps that has been a good development. But there are sort of signals that there may be sort of future changes in EU competition policy and industrial policy, and I think that's something that it will then be important for Sweden.
I want to ask Professor Pontus a question first before we take more of a conversation, all of us, because you are an expert in entrepreneurship, and looking at Professor Roderick's slide on good jobs, we had productivity, we had entrepreneurship, we had labor market policies. When it comes to entrepreneurship, it seems like we are doing both good and bad. We have not as good venture capital system as the US, perhaps. We have a lot of self-employment, also some Schumpeterian entrepreneurship. But where do we stand? Where are we compared to, for example, the US on the entrepreneurship position?
Well, I think we're doing fairly good. But let me start with what I think is the interesting part of your presentation when we talk about entrepreneurship. It has to do with that the contemporary growth models, they do explain why firms invest in knowledge, in R&D, and why society benefits from that. But what they do not explain is how knowledge is diffused and converted into some kind of societal use. I think that's not a flaw perhaps, but it's something that should be elaborated somewhat deeper. And there entrepreneurship policies comes in, because that's one missing link. So I think there is a support. You need to bring up that issue of entrepreneurial activities and how they can contribute to enhanced welfare and to increase prosperity. And that is sort of not so much on the agenda, even if we call these models the neo-Schumpeterian model, etc. Has to be a balance between risks and potential rewards. Another part there has to do with the mobility of labor, because we're all knowledge carrier. We may overlap to some extent when it comes to our knowledge. But we are different for sure. We have different experience, and we do are knowledgeable about different things. So when we move around also, knowledge is diffused. Some pick up ideas that is turned into an innovation, and there is an emerging, interesting empirical literature finding that there is a strong positive relationship between labor mobility and innovation, actually. So that's another part. And then that has to be combined with modifications in the social security systems, probably. Because if we are entering an era of more gig and sharing economy, whole labor market may be turned upside down in a sense. We're not there yet, but it may be possible that we are self-employed, we have a part-time work, we work towards an app, that's how we earn our income. What does that imply for our social security systems? Well, that should also be, and there is some work done by firm and in the UK, for instance, on these issues, and Taylor in particular, I would say. These rights has to follow the individual more and not be so attached to the working place of the employer.
Correct.
So part of that has to be analyzed and probably reforms.
Lars wanted to come in. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I have two comments. I think behind the theme here is sort of an implicit notion that now technological change and structural transformation is unusually fast. And I'm old enough to have been to a number of seminars on similar issues over the years. And at every such seminar, I have heard that now technological change and structural transformation is unusually fast.
Is it different this time?
Yes, it can't be true all the time. And when people have looked at evidence on it, they usually do not find that structural transformation is unusually fast, because it's always going on. So I think that is one thing to
So
keep
are you
in
a techno-pessimist?
mind. No, I'm a realist, I think. Then about industrial policy. Yes, one can say, like Carolina did, that some of the things you outlined seem to be going on in Sweden. But on the other hand, I think you were rather vague in some respects. So I did not completely understand exactly what specific advice on the setup of the system should one derive from what you said. But maybe everyone else did understand that, and maybe shortcoming on my part. There is one thing, though, that I would like to stress, and that we have, I think, in Sweden, a skeptical attitude towards industrial policy. We don't think that the government can pick winners, or is not very good at it. And it's not, subsidies of specific industries is not allowed anymore. But what does happen then? Well, it is that the government instead tries to sort of interfere very much in the allocation of research funds, because that is allowed. You can give resources to areas which will you think will benefit certain industries. But I think that is very risky. I mean, I think the government is even worse at predicting where good research results will come, even worse than sort of picking winners among industries. So I think that is a really serious risk that one should be aware of, and governments should stay away from sort of trying to influence exact decisions on how to allocate research funds.
Carolina.
Well, since I have worked in government, I mean, I share some of the concerns that Lars is voicing. I think it's in government. I think you really experience that there is a clear risk of sort of capture, and when you go very deep into this kind of interaction with industries that and firms that want different things. But I think Professor Roderick did mention one aspect that I myself have always thought is sort of an organizing principle for considering when it is relevant for the government to really engage and try to do something, and that is when there is some sort of coordination failure or coordination problem where actions by the government can really solve this problem. I think that's sort of identifying those kind of situations can be important for having a better outcome without sort of compromising the actions of government agencies or civil servants and leading to a lack of accountability.
It almost sounds a little bit like a triple helix where you have a cooperation between business, governments and education. And traditionally the US has been quite good at these cooperations, and maybe Europe has lagged a little bit. And for entrepreneurs it's really important that you have these cooperations, perhaps.
To some extent, I mean, the triple helix was a great success in terms of coining a concept. But what is lacking there, I think, is that you do also need incentive structures. But going back to technology, you know, it was already when the printing machine was introduced 1474, I think, in Augsburg, then the wood carvers were out there saying, we have to stop this. But in the end, they actually had more jobs than they had before because they became illustrators. So research the view there is when you look back, we have exaggerated the problems with technological change. And I'm very much an optimist, I think, because I'm not sure that I can have a realistic perception about the future. But turning to the governmental role, it's of course critically important because they set the rules of the game. But I'm more hesitant to large-scale intervention by the government, and I'm not sure whether that was what you proposed. But there is a textbook reason, so to speak, when you have high uncertainty, there's no private capital, then the government can go in there, and if you combine that with, you know, potentially very big gains for society if you succeed, well, then you have sort of the role model for why the government should intervene. But that has to be paired with a process for evaluating the effects of that intervention. And you need clear criteria from the beginning. What are you trying to attain with this intervention? And my experience from working also with the government, but through these different committees and so on, is that there's a compact resistance to that type of evaluation. They don't like it, whether it is politicians or governmental authorities. It's viewed as a threat more than as a constructive instrument to enhance what you're doing. So I think that's very difficult. And it's also other difficulties there linked to how to define these. We can think of certain areas, but it's a tricky business, and it's a subtle balance there actually. So I would prefer much more of the carrot sort of avenue that you proposed here. And you had DARPA there, you have public procurement of innovations and things like that, some R&D subs, some collaboration from time to time, but then you are you have that risk of gaming, as you put it, or regulatory capture and those things. So I think it's a difficult path for policies. So more of the carrot and stick, I would argue.
Yes, now we have been speaking broadly. Would you like to continue, Lars, or?
If I'm allowed to.
Yes, you are, but we have some more specific questions as well then, when they're coming up. Yeah.
No, I wanted to return to what I thought was one of your main messages, and that's the worry about good jobs and income distribution. Am I allowed to?
You are allowed to.
Sure. Okay. No, I mean, I both agree and disagree. I mean, I agree that this is really a challenge, and it's, I mean, also in the political context. I mean, the threat of political populism. And I agree, I mean, that the education system, in a broad sense, is really important. And I agree with you, Pontus, that we have far too little of evaluations of the sort of effectiveness of various education programs. I mean, it's basic education at school, it's adult education, it's language training for immigrants. Far too little of sort of social cost-benefit analysis there. That is a problem. So I agree, of course, on the importance of education. But then I disagree a little bit where we come to the role of tax and transfer policies. I think to get employment for low-skilled workers and for low-skilled immigrants in particular, we must let market forces work. In Sweden, with very high minimum wages, it means lower minimum wages. But then it should be the task of the tax and transfer system to compensate for this when it comes to distribution of disposable incomes. And there I think the Swedish system has been failing, in a sense that transfers have not kept up with wage developments. And that has contributed to an increasing share of poor people in Sweden.
So what you're saying is that you have a too high minimum wage for a group of people, and the market should decide instead, or?
Yes, and they don't get jobs with the high minimum wages. So with lower minimum wages, they would get jobs, but then it's a task of society to see to it that does not affect disposable incomes and sort of increase disposable income inequality even more. It has been increasing in Sweden over the last 2-3 decades, but it's not because of wage developments, it's because of developments in the tax and transfer system.
Which is lacking.
Yes, well, just to comment on that, of course, in Sweden, what we have instead of maybe a process with falling minimum wages is a lot of subsidized jobs, which to a certain extent, should be substitutable. But I think there is something when it comes to the uptake of these subsidies that leaves something to be desired. So I think the government has struggled with getting sort of increasing the volumes of these subsidized jobs. So that's something that I think is sort of current work and where the current focus is when it comes to dealing with the problem of having a group that lack the kind of skills and qualifications to get regular jobs.
But if one maybe makes an assumption that we have a quite large structural adjustment also for the middle income earners, how would you, if that happened, what kind of agenda would you see fit for Sweden going forward if we actually had a technological shift that influenced, for example, people in the intermediary sector and service sector and trade and banking and so on a more larger scale. So play around with that you are techno-optimist for a little while. How would you deal with it?
I believe that this can't be separated, of course, from the education system. And then we're also into incentives and those kind of issues. So they have to be combined. We have huge matching problems on the labor market, and we have had that for a long time, and they have been increasing over time also. So just letting the labor market taking care of this is of course not possible. I think there is another role for universities to play here. Even people with the higher educations need to be re-educated. Many of them are in this sort of middle category of income earners. And that would be, they could play a very constructive role here. And there is room also for policies, but wage subsidies seems to have failed most of the time. There are some, but Lars knows this much better, reforms that have been successful, but basically these are quite few. And I believe that in Denmark, a Stanford researcher, Peri, looked at what happened when the wages were lower for new entrants into the labor market, and he didn't find that there were any transmission to other groups, that their wages also were affected and so on. So lowering wages, referring to what Lars said, is probably one instrument you need there too.
Should we rebalance the taxing system so we would have less taxes on labor that are very high in Sweden compared to, and instead maybe more tax on capital in order to have the incomes that are needed for the public sector to keep welfare up? Lars?
Yeah, no, that is what I have been arguing in favor of. Of course, there are negative adverse effects of, I mean, from the point of view of incentives to invest and so on, from higher capital income taxation. But we also know that the increase in income inequality comes from the capital income side. And I think we have to decide what we think is most important. And then I would go for lowering labor taxes and increasing capital income taxes instead. Then, I mean, as to the question of if we have a big structural transformation, how are we going to deal with it and for the sort of middle skilled group? I would advocate more focus on upgrading skills when you're still in employment. So I would like to see some form of mandatory savings sort of paid for by employers because of these sort of externalities involved. I think it should be sort of a government-run system where you can use these savings to upgrade your skills, but of course it must be quite tough monitoring that it's used for that and not for more leisure. But I think that's where we have to do more. Then we have systems to take care of those who are laid off. Not so much anymore the public employment service, Arbetsförmedlingen, because they deal with the marginal groups that can't enter. But there we have the labor market parties organizations, Trygghetsfonden, Trygghetsstiftelsen, and so on, which seem to work rather well. But I think the problem is you should prepare people, have them upgrade their skills before they are laid off.
Both in companies and in the public sector and all kinds of labor places.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Carolina wanted to come in.
Yes, I mean, it was a comment regarding taxation. I think, and Lars alluded to this, but if you look at developments when it comes to income inequality in Sweden, I mean, there are essentially two factors driving the increased inequality. So it's the significant rise when it comes to the top income, and that's related to capital income. And then it's also being driven by the lower end of the income distribution, which is related to a decrease in replacement rates in various social insurance systems. So, and I agree with Lars that I think the system that we have probably need to be used in order to redistribute more, to have better taxation of capital income, and also have better insurance for people that need to use this insurance, in particular if we are going to face layoffs and increased unemployment.
When you say better capital income taxation, you mean higher?
Higher, yes. Okay, yes, higher. Perhaps not better for everyone.
Montes, would you like to comment as well, or
I think
we have some more questions too?
These are okay. Sure. These are. I think it's a good suggestion with these saving accounts. So they have been tried in UK. They didn't work at all. But there are some up and running, like in Singapore, for instance. But I think it's important that the expenditures are shared between the employer, the employee, and the government, actually, to have more of incentivized structures.
Yes, I would like to go further. Question to Carolina Ekholm concerning globalization. I mean, Daniel Roderick was talking about the backlash against globalization, and that is something that has hit Sweden as well. But in what way do you think we should deal with this, and what kind of counter strategy is appropriate for Europe? I mean, in a kind of trade war that we see at the moment, should Europe retaliate in the way that it threatens to do?
Well, I think it's inevitable with retaliation if EU is hit by tariffs by the United States, for instance. I mean, it's not a good development, obviously. It's something that everyone loses from, and in particular the countries that introduce the tariffs. But I think you can't let that slide. It's a way to try to uphold the multilateral open trading system. But of course, Europe is not the main target for the United States under the current administration's trade war, and I think there are arguments for trying to maybe work with the United States to have a better working WTO. I think there are problems there, partly related to China, that where the United States could be an ally. Of course, it's quite difficult to do that while being slapped with tariffs, so it's not an environment conducive for collaboration. But I think for Sweden, maybe what is a stronger threat is what I was talking about before, which is these signals that the larger countries want to reshape EU industrial and competition policy. I think there, and I mean, so many of you probably know that this came, and it's in particular France and Germany, and this came when a merger between Siemens and Alstom was blocked by the EU competition authority. And I think for the small countries, it's very important to ensure that if there is an overhaul, and I think there are signals also from the incoming commission that they want to work on this, that doesn't mean that the single market is being impaired, or that the EU is starting to become protectionist through its industrial policy, because that is, I mean, for the large countries, you know, they can handle that, but for the smaller countries, that's going to be very problematic.
We'll give the word to Lars, but then start thinking about questions, because we're going to invite you asking questions. Lars.
Yes, I also want to make an optimistic comment. Of course, we all are worried about the trade wars and trade restrictions, but luckily enough, Sweden is in a process with an aging population. From this point of view, because that means that savings, according to theory, savings of the country should go down. What is savings, financial savings of the country? Well, that's the trade surplus. We are having a rather big trade surplus. That should go down, according to the life cycle hypothesis on consumption. And if the trade surplus goes down, that must mean that the tradable sector, the export sector, should shrink. And sort of resources should be moved instead to the non-tradable sector and sort of the government sector. So that is
So
a
you
bit
find that
optimistic.
positive?
It will help us. It's not that optimistic for the tradable sector and the manufacturing sector.
But
And
it
I see
depends
Mats Kinvall there. He
Yeah.
doesn't like what
We
I'm
have a
saying.
panel. We have a panel coming up after the
Yeah,
break,
so he
which
can
will probably
retaliate
comment on that
later,
one.
but,
Yeah.
Yes, this might be somewhat helpful for us.
But it builds on this smooth transmission across sectors where skills can be utilized in one sector that was utilized in another before and so on. So it's tricky. There are some.
Yes, but it could be worse.
It could be worse. Could always be worse.
Let's hear if you have. We have a question there. Please tell your name and have short questions,
Well,
please.
I think that we have to put the questions together then for answers.
Yeah, we start there.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Carl Kempe.
Try it again.
My name is Carl Kempe. You've heard that we need good jobs, and the good jobs mainly come from entrepreneurs. So we have an entrepreneur system that doesn't work in Sweden, especially because we feel that income distribution, wealth distribution is something bad. Actually, I think that's what's driving the economy and driving especially the possibility for entrepreneurs to create jobs.
So what is your question?
What do think about this?
Okay. Then we have a question over there. Yeah.
Håkan Jagels is my name. There was a question to the panel, how to increase the competence in government. No one answered that. I would like to have an answer, please.
So we take these two questions to start with. Yeah.
Shall I?
You can start, Pontus. I think that first question was to you.
Right, okay. So entrepreneurs, I would agree very much with you that these are the agents of change, and all the more radical innovations, they seem to stem from smaller, young, entrepreneurially driven firms. Then they are picked up by larger firms at some point often, and they become synonymous with that large firms. But from the beginning, it's the smaller, the new started firms. So that's a dynamism that we want to see more of. And wealth creation that comes from that sort of effort and risk-taking, I think is much more accepted than, for instance, different types of vested interests and regulatory capture and monopoly situations, etc. So I agree very much with you.
Okay. And the competence of government, does Carolina want to say anything about
Well,
that?
I mean, I feel that this question reflects on me somehow, since I have been working in government. But you know, I am a professor, so I don't know what more I can do in terms of formal, at least formal competence. And of course, my experience with where I have been working is not that there's a lack of competence, on the contrary. But one thing that I am quite engaged in is to trying to promote the idea that we actually should have a proper education in governance in Sweden. I mean, partly for people who then work in government, could also be working in other organizations, but there is a certain lack, like we don't really have education in public policy and these things. And that seems to be strange when you think, I mean, we are quite well known for, I mean, at least relative to other countries in Europe, for instance, we are known to have fairly good governance in the public sector, but we don't really educate people with a view to that.
So that's
But
something
you
that
are
you
a good
asked for.
example of the importance of mobility.
Yes. We wanted now to conclude by having you summarize maybe one or two things that you would like to send to politicians when it comes to preparing ourselves for, even if it's not going to happen, how we can prepare ourselves for a structural adjustment because of technological change. One or two things that you want to send along to politicians. What would you say? Start with you, Pontus.
Okay, first I like to say that globalization is probably not the main culprit for the increase the widening of income distribution that we see. I would claim that it has more to do with skill-based technological change, even though we have this equivalence there. But within countries, that seems to be the fact from research. So there, policies has to rest on two pillars. One is augmenting, upgrading knowledge. Another role for universities is lifelong learning also for people with a higher education. The other pillar is how is that knowledge diffused into some kind, converted into societal useful activities. And then you're into labor markets, you're into the tax systems, you're into mobility, entrepreneurship. And I think we have sort of downplayed the importance of that, and instead we have had different objectives. 2% of GDP should be R&D, etc., etc. It goes for us, and it goes for Europe and many other countries. So actually emphasizing more of that diffusion and converting policies, that I think will be very important.
Lars.
Yeah, I don't have any grand vision like that, like Pontus. I just want to comment on yes, the importance of entrepreneurs. We all realize that they are very important, extremely important for growth, for innovation, for employment, and it's probably the case that sort of the widening of the income distribution in Sweden and the larger share going to capital and capital incomes has been good for entrepreneurship. But economic policy is always a trade-off. So that doesn't mean that income distribution should go on and be widened forever. And sort of my judgment and my evaluation is that it's probably gone too far.
But you could do real estate tax, but you could maybe do something better on stock options for risk takers in new companies. You could actually do different things.
I mean, yes, you could sort of adjust the system in various ways to alleviate the trade-offs. But still, I think there is a trade-off. We have made a number of reforms reducing taxes on capital, and overall, I think that has gone too far.
Carolina, do you have any grand visions?
No, but let me say, well, I think in principle we do have the sort of the basic tools to deal with structural adjustment, and I mean we do have that because we are a small open economy, so we have been dealing with structural adjustment for a long time. But of course, the tools that we do have, like when it comes to education and training, and subsidized jobs and employment service doing matching, and I mean this could be done better, of course. So there needs to be constant work on trying to figure out how we can improve these various tools, and evaluating them would be a good basis for that. But let me say something else when it comes to more of what Professor Roderick was talking about, and the role of innovation and entrepreneurs. That I think, as I mentioned, Sweden do have certain elements of what he was talking about, because we have our history, and there's always been a lot of dialogue between the government and the social partners. But I think there is an issue there, that there are some groups that aren't really represented in those dialogues, which would be sort of startups or people who are not really part of the business community yet, and there are sort of obviously groups in the labor market that aren't properly represented by the trade unions. So I think there's an area perhaps where one can do better also.
Thank you very much. Let's give them an applause. We meet again at 11 o'clock. Welcome.
Nu behöver vi 4 bord ju. Jaha, okej. Ja, men okej, bra. Ja, okej.
Welcome back. We are now going to have the second panel, and on stage we will have...
First we will have in the line that is Karl-Henrik Svanberg, who is a Swedish International Business Manager, who is the chairman of AB Volvo and has been the chairman of BP, the international energy company. He has also been the CEO of Ericsson and before that of Assa Abloy. Mr. Svanberg is now the chairman of IVA, the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering and Sciences. But on the top of that, he's also the chairman of the European Roundtable of Industrialists.
And we also have Sara Örvall. She's Chief Digital, Customer Experience and Communications Officer at the bank SEB. She has been Senior Vice President at Bonnier, responsible for global R&D, and a founder of the consultancy network Mindmill and CEO of the Differ Strategy Consulting. Her expertise is in digitalization, innovation, consumer behavior, and technology. Welcome.
And then we have Mats Kinnvall, who is Chief Economist at the Association of Swedish Engineering Industries, Teknikföretagen. Before that, he had a similar position in the Swedish Association of Industrial Employers, Industriarbetsgivarna. He has also been a chief analyst at Handelsbanken and chief economist at the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, SKL. Please.
And finally, not least but best, here comes Katarina Lundahl, who is chief economist at Unionen, the large white-collar union in the private sector. Before, she held a similar position at SSR, the Union for Professionals. She has also been the chief economist of the Liberal Party and worked as an economic and financial desk officer at the EU Commission. So welcome.
Yes, first I would like to ask all of you in what way you think that Professor Rodrik's perspectives are relevant for Sweden and for Europe. What options do you think we have in Sweden? Please.
Yes, does it work? I think it was a very interesting presentation, and I think in Sweden we have so far managed quite well to, when these middle jobs have disappeared, to upskill people better than in the US. But I think there will be a challenge on the other hand has been that we have created almost too many upskilled jobs because there haven't been enough people to take them. So that's a different type of problem. And now I think even though we have managed this challenge so far pretty well, I think that doesn't mean that that our systems and models will handle it well in the future. So I think we absolutely have challenges ahead and need and all parties, both the state and the parts in the labor market, need to do adoptions and changes. And that goes for us as well. For example, when the labor market changes, when people don't have permanent employments anymore, but they are self-employed or employed by platforms, well, our approach is that we have to organize everyone who works, in which form they do it. And only then can we continue to play an active role in the labor market and to guarantee more and better jobs in the future.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Lars Calmfors, believe it or not, in the sense that I don't think I think Professor Rodrik's view is more like applicable to the US than to Europe in general and to Sweden in particular, because I mean, just to point out, robotization and technological change, that has gone on for 50 or so years, especially within the manufacturing industry. So that is more or less already, we're through most of that. So I don't think that's not the challenge. The challenge ahead is that the service service sector and jobs in the service sector. Those are the ones that are threatened, so to speak, by technological change, and I think that might be a real challenge. And I also think that the labor market regulation that we have today, that's a reflection of the labor market and the economic structure in the 70s, as many has been pointing out here. So I think that the regulation of the labor market has to be changed. It's not relevant for the state of the Swedish economy, the Swedish labor market right now, and I think there will be changes. There is a consensus, I think, among the labor market actors and also politicians that something has to be done here. But let's see what's happening.
Next one, please.
Well, I think we all share your description of the challenges and opportunities that we, as a country and as a world, are facing. I think Sweden is a bit of a special country. We're a small country and we have disadvantages in scale and so on, but we're also, there is an advantage of that we are close, that we can talk to each other in the way we do here, and we can almost reach anyone in society for a discussion about some issues, which means that I think we have had an ability to come together and actually deal with quite significant challenges. And I don't think you can't regulate your country to success. You have to create the success. Then you can always, as Lars Calmfors talks about, you can discuss how you're going to split the positive effects and share those among people. But so in that way, I don't think some of the professors' thoughts about how to regulate, I think, is not necessarily the way forward for Sweden.
Sorry, Rod.
Well, I thought I'd just give you a snapshot of the actual changes we're in the middle of. So I'm in the financial industry, and right now the most cutting edge in the financial industry products are not developed by traditional banks, but rather by tech platforms. And why is that? Well, if you look at, for example, Amazon, which is a large financial service players nowadays in the US, they now have 310 million customers having their credit cards associated with Amazon. JP Morgan Chase, as an example, has only a sixth of that. So Amazon is 6 times larger. And then when we look at China and you look at Alipay, which is the financial provider of Alibaba, they have 800 million customers in their profile. And they track everything they do. And on top of that, they do major investment in AI. So that means that when they launch a money market fund, they are within months the largest in the world, because the power of that data is so enormous. And then I can go on. Tencent has 800 million customers, and they bought like 30 different AI startups recently. So the power of that change is enormous, and the scale is very, very impressive. So last week we were with our board in San Francisco to meet with different AI companies to understand how can we participate in this development, how can we be part of it. And when we met with Stanford, they tell us that, you know, our researchers right now, we have a huge problem in our AI research because we do not have the power and the data as these large companies. Neither do we have the processing power, the machines that can handle these large computational models. Neither do we have the analytical tools. So we cannot perform cutting-edge research. That has to be done by these companies. So that makes me think, like, if they're at that stage and we cannot produce that scale in Sweden, we just have to be much smarter in the way we would compete. We need to find that scale in another way, by pooling data, by opening up borders, at least within Europe. But right now, our starting point where we're clearly at a disadvantage. We are behind. And yes, we may have robotized the industrial world, but when we robotize our brains, this is a different game. And that game, at least for us, it's happening right now. It's not next year or within 5 years, it's now. So when we look at our complete activities, we have this report that says with existing technologies, we can actually phase out 40% of all employees now. It doesn't mean we're going to do that, but we can because of technology. So I think the power of automizing services is just very, very strong, and we have to be prepared for that change.
it sounds like the structural adjustment, listening to you, is larger, especially than in the service sector, as you say, Sara. I know, Carl-Henrik, that you are the chairman of the ERT, the European Roundtable. If I was a fly on the wall and you were sitting there, you 55 large European companies discussing where we are going and the policies that are needed, what would I hear if I was on that wall?
Well, I think you would find it a very interesting discussion. These are the largest, the most important companies of Europe, and what we do, we come together and see if we can unite around messages that we can push to politicians. First of all, if you put things in a bit of perspective, we had a time in the, say, from 1850 to 1920, when we had huge disruptive change with innovations, electricity, telephony, explosion engines, steam machine, all those things changed society dramatically. We've had since then more of a sort of incremental development, step by step, until now the digital age, and so also much in Sweden. Sweden was actually in those days, in the old days, very entrepreneurial. If you think about what Lars Magnus Ericsson or Sigfrid Edström or all these, what they did with these companies, establish themselves around the world with one leading technology, but fantastic. After that, it's been quite incremental. We're going into a disruptive era again with the digitalization. And I think this is going to change our societies fundamentally in every single thing we do. Not just companies, but how we take care of elderly, healthcare, schooling, everything. And that creates a bit of a drama. When we look at this from a European Roundtable, and back to the professor's footloose companies, it's actually positive, I think, that when we come to join to the conclusion, that obvious conclusion, that we as companies, even though we are global and we have just one share, a smaller share in Europe of sales, we cannot long-term be successful unless Europe and our countries are successful. And that means that we have agreed on 6 pledges. I'll just mention a few of them, but we are coming to politicians not with any asks. We're coming and saying what we will do, because we think we need to play our part. The first part is invest more in Europe and in jobs in both R&D and in industry. And that has to do also with that Asia is not and China is not as competitive anymore. Income has increased, so it's better to have more of your activities closer together. We are going to invest all we can in digitalization and AI. But here we are seriously nervous. We are falling behind. If you look at China, China is already investing 3-4 times more in AI research and development than we do. America, 6, 7, 8 times more. We're not too late to catch up, but it starts to be very close to too late. What AI is also built on connectivity in society. It has all to do with our connectivity networks. 5G is being rolled out at full pace in China. It's being basically on a government instruction, if you like. It's rolled out in the US. AT&T, Verizon, just make sure we are competitive. Nothing happens in Europe. And without connectivity network, we don't need to bother about creating connected factories or autonomous driving or whatever you want to do. So this is serious. That leads also to the question of upskilling. In previous times when we have got new technologies, you can start a department to do that, and you can hire some experts with that new technology. This is touching everything. We can't change out our entire workforce and employ a new one. We have to upscale everyone. We are not asking for any help from society to do that. We're ready to do that. But we also urge society to take care of its parts. And we think public-private partnerships, best practice, and sharing of knowledge will be important here. Climate change, different from digital. Europe is in the lead. We think we have to push to be in the lead, and we have lots to contribute, and we need to safeguard a strategy that gets us to the Paris goals. And then finally, free trade. Europe, and not the least Sweden, we have built our welfare state and our success as an industrial nation on free trade. But the globalization model that we had, we shouldn't fool ourselves that it's just a Trump issue, that he throws tariffs now, and when he steps down, this will all go away and be free trade again. This was a model built by us in the developed market globalizing the others. It was not them globalizing us. I mean, there are differences here, and I think you can see all the Democratic candidates in the US, none of them are saying, I'm going to reverse tariffs if I get elected. I think we are coming back to more of bilateral things. In all of this and the game power battle between US and Europe, in that power battle, it's very hard to see that Europe can succeed 28 countries on their own. There's a very united push for leveraging the strength of EU, which is an economy as big as the US. We just don't get the power out of it. So that's what you would hear.
Yep. I think I would have a good time.
Yes. Just to follow up, focusing on Sweden, in this hall earlier this week there was a report from EVA concerning lack of competence in Sweden, and Katarina Lundahl was referring to the same problem, that we don't have enough people with high skills here in order to fulfill all the things that should be done. In what way do you think that that companies could in some way solve that problem, and what could the public sector do to solve the problems?
Well, first of all, I think I've said it in other situations, but when I grew up in Porteous, northern Sweden, but when you saw bridges being built, dams, there were TV came, and there was telephony and all those things, engineering was an obvious great thing to be involved in. Today, you don't see engineering in society as obvious. In China, I think it's 50% of the kids in high school and so on, they choose STEM subjects. It's down to 15% in the Western world. We just don't get enough engineers. So EVA is running a project called Tekniksprånget, which means that we let young students after high school do an internship for 4 months. We have run through, working as an engineer, we run through 5,000 students, 60% before they start say, this is going to be interesting, but I'm not going to become an engineer. After the internship, 80% says, applies and starts to study as an engineer. We have problems of explaining how exciting it actually is. And this is the biggest task we have, and I think it's a societal issue because we're going to run short of engineers.
Maybe Mats and Katarina would like to comment on this as well. Yeah, you want to start, Katarina?
Yeah, I think as you said, Karl-Henrik, it's like you can't just fire a whole workforce and hire a new one because it isn't there. So you have to work with the workforce you have. And I think the large companies are starting to realizing this and to train them, and that you have to look into the future and sort of see which groups you can move. But for small, medium-sized firms, this is very difficult. And it comes back to also what Mr. Roderick showed, that the productivity differences between the large firms and the smaller firms are increasing. And I think this, I'm sure, is happening in Sweden too. And some research done by Tillväxtverket points to that the ability to take up these new technologies are, I mean, the big firms are very good at it, but the small firms are actually quite bad at it. And firms in Stockholm is better at it than in the country. And I think one aspect that we haven't talked about is the regional aspect. That we have had a very good job growth of high-skilled jobs in the urban areas. But there are areas in Sweden where the growth of high-skilled jobs haven't been as prominent. And that creates tensions, even though overall we are faring pretty well. So I think all these things creates new challenges in terms of upskilling, and I think the companies have to do planning to make this happen. But I think the state needs to help, and other parties too, for the smaller companies. They can't do this by themselves. So there, I guess we need new type of policies there.
Mats, do you agree?
Well, it might come as a surprise, but I'm representing the engineering industry, and of course it's important to have engineers, but I'm an economist. So when I think about growth and so on, I tend to stress the economic factors. So I think technology is like a necessary condition. But what really makes a difference is economic factors like institutions, organization, leadership, so on and so forth. We had this interesting literature by Robert Lucas about making a miracle. And Robert Lucas shows that the thing that really points out the gazelles and the dinosaurs is the way you organize society and organize your firms and so on. So it's a matter of non-hierarchical structures, mixing competencies with different people moving horizontally and vertically and cross-fertilizing each other and so on. So I'm not sure that, I personally don't think that China ever will reach our level living standards despite all these engineers, as long as they don't do something really radical to other things, the way the economy is working. But that's not to downplay the importance of technicians and engineers, but it's not enough. So we have to think of the whole economy, how we organize the society and markets and so on and so forth.
So
as an economist,
sorry,
isn't it a problem that we categorize still, that there's the engineers over here and then the others? Because actually I can't see any profession that does not need some sort of computer science, some sort of skills that are linked to what we are calling engineers today, because as this is moving into every industry, every task will involve some sort of interaction with pretty advanced machines, and it requires your capability to understand them, to even manage, to even draw up like what's the business model of our company of the future. So I think also we need to think about how do we infuse that competence across the board among doctors, among lawyers everywhere. So, and that will help a lot.
That's my point. The crucial thing is, are we good at using all the technology or not? And I don't even think that we have to develop technology in Sweden. We can just as well buy it on the shelf in the global market. But those that are the best to utilize technology, those will be the winners, not necessarily those that develop the new technology. So I totally agree with you.
But I don't agree with that.
But let me go back to let me go back to Sarah about the service industry, where big changes are going on. I mean, that is like in banking that you were working with, but also in trade and retail and so on. And what do you foresee then? And I mean, also the labor market impact. What will happen with the jobs?
Well, I think the reason why we can't buy technology is because, of course, we can practically. But the thing is, if we don't have more people who understand the deep development, the deep tech, we will not be able to write our own future. Because this is a lot about to do with AI ethics. Like, how would you, in our industry, how would you like write a credit model? Who will get a loan and who will not? That will be handled by computers, and those computers you better sure understand at the depth of it, because otherwise the computers will give us instructions and support for decisions that we don't really understand. So there's something about that this computational power is actually what's going to be the management support, it's going to be the whole sort of framework of our companies and our society. So I think I'm quite worried, actually, the opposite, that a lot of the entrepreneurial climate in Sweden, we've had tremendous success with a lot of unicorns and beautiful entrepreneurship. But if you look at the characteristics of them, they're quite seldom deep tech. We don't have enough investments in like the really like deep processing power, quantum computing technologies, the things that underpin the innovations in the front end. And we need to do both. So, and in order to remain successful, I think that's what we need. We need both of those competences, and we need both of that sort of, or that breadth of companies. But your question was about
well, it was banking, retail, and what will happen in those sectors? I mean, particularly when it comes to labor market impact.
I think there are others in the room who are better to understand like how this will, in a broader sense, change society. But what I do think and what I see is that if we can't compete with massive scale, then we have to be much more creative in terms of how do we pool things. And I think what we do have in Sweden in particular, and in Europe possibly as well, like we have this trust and we're quite good at forming smart collaboration projects, etc. So if natural language processing, one part of AI, is very difficult for small nations, we have a hard time developing these AI bots that would speak to people because we speak a language with little data. So we at SEB, we cannot develop our own systems, but we could pool with SAS or public service, or like very creatively form a group of companies together with research to build something that's pretty smart. Or we can, in the banking industry, as some of you may know, we had huge problem with anti-money laundering across the industry. And then you could say, can each company be good at this? Can we be worldwide cutting edge in detecting financial crime? Maybe not, but maybe if we pool all the data across all banks, together with the financial police, together with everyone, then we could see patterns, and then we can develop systems that are smarter than in the rest of the world. So I think possibly that will be the way that we can create both competences and cutting edge, that we're better than others to form that sort of networks and coalitions and smart collaborations.
It sounds like when I hear that Mats says we can buy the technology, Sara says we need to do some of this ourselves, and we need to have, and Carl-Henrik, you say we have to have a European perspective. How important is it to have the sort of domestic national capacity, perhaps head offices, and to keep this within a region or a country at least? Just taking the example of banking, where maybe Amazon and Facebook and Google can come in and take over, and also retail. Do you foresee that we are going to keep to national domestic policies, trying to keep it here, or doesn't it matter? Do you have any views on this?
Well, it's if you look at Sweden's position in the world is a result, I think, of these entrepreneurs very much in the long time ago, and those companies' ability to grow throughout the world. I think we're now witnessing again, after having been very entrepreneurial once upon a time and then hardly at all, we're bringing back entrepreneurship into Sweden in a fantastic way. If you look at Silicon Valley, everybody's looking at Silicon Valley, but you can go to Shenzhen in China, it's the same thing, just bigger. But if you look at Sweden, Stockholm is named with a lot of respect, even in Silicon Valley, for its entrepreneurship. So we're starting to do something, I think, very positive here. But if I think about these large companies, what they have done here if you take Ericsson in Kista, and you see as many in the myriad of small companies around there, which are spin-offs from Ericsson, people have left and started things and so on. If we hadn't had these large companies, if we hadn't had our ability to create and produce and develop, and we had everything acquired, that I think in the long run is not a good.
How important is it then to keep the headquarters of large companies in Sweden? I mean, we still have a risk for many more leaving.
I think we have. Many of you remember in the 90s when we had in Dagens Industri, so many companies have now left. There was a time when the economic policies weren't supportive enough, but I think it's actually quite crucial. I don't think it may happen so much if you move the headquarters somewhere else in the first 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but it's whether that should be the case or not, but life is not always rational. So when you're sitting there in a headquarters, you know you have to close down a research and development site. Do you close down the one that you can see from the office, or do you close down someone that is far away? You end up closing it far away. So I think that the effects when you move out a headquarter over a 20, 30-year perspective is pretty severe.
Do you have any other views on this, Katarina?
No, I agree on that. I think, and also, I mean, Sweden has a lot of big companies, but nowadays a lot of them have moved production out of Sweden, but so far often kept research and other sort of high-skilled jobs and other sort of headquarters services, and that has been fantastic for Sweden. So I think it's very dangerous if they move, because then the link will be weak. But I think something coming back to the question Sarah got on what will happen to all the people in the service sector. I think first of all we're used to these structural changes. It might be now on a bigger scale than we are used to, and I think we have to start thinking, like I think someone in the panel before said, that you cannot just skill or upgrade people when they get unemployed. You have to start a lot earlier. And you have to think differently, and that is in the companies, but also what you provide to people and what you expect of people. And that's a sort of a new mindset. But also I think often people, it takes maybe less than you think to reskill them to a different occupation. You just have to think a bit differently. Like, okay, if you've been an accountant, you're good at rules, maybe then you can use that capacity to something completely different, and that people can actually change occupations and what business they work in more than we have been doing.
You have a very broad membership in your union,
Yes.
But does that mean also that it's a risk that many people will fall behind among your members in this process?
Yeah.
And how should that be dealt with?
That is an obvious risk that we are concerned about. Because we have many members who have high qualifications and been to university, but many who hasn't, who have just sort of worked their way up. We are looking into all different ways that we can ourselves actually start to give them support to see what competences do you have, how can you sort of improve, what would you need to do to empower them. But then I think we also are in the process of negotiating with the employers and the state and to change rules and to also set up maybe new systems for this sort of transformation and make it maybe less, financially more viable for the person to leave a job and to study and all these different things. And not just when you get unemployed, but before. So I think we will try to do things for our members, and that's a lot to sort of wake them up also. Because maybe they think like, oh, that won't happen to me. And I think everyone has to think about their competences. So that's a challenge for us to make them aware that they need to take some steps now.
Mats, you have, on the company side, you have problems with your productivity. You might not invest enough. Are you prepared for this change of labor on the labor market? Are you doing enough?
No, I mean it's the companies that have to do the bulk of the work. Of course, they have to be attractive and they have to increase the skill of their labor force. So that's but of course the politicians have to do their part, and the education system. And as there are some initiatives here. We have among the labor market parties, etc., etc. We're trying to enhance competence and so on. But just two short ones. The first is that we have made some studies lately that show that the international value chain is actually starting to reverse. Yeah. That is, the import content in the Swedish export industry is actually starting to increase, especially in the the car industry. And what they're doing, they're taking back production, and they're reshoring and they're insourcing production actually. So that's an interesting factor. I think that might be one part of one reason why productivity growth and so on and global trade has slowed down for the last 10 or 15 years. So globalization is backtracking, so to speak, or reversing. And the other one is that when we speak to companies and their leaders, they stress lack of competence. But of course, engineers is an important factor, but at least as much as skilled workers that really know how to handle the factory, how to handle the sawmill, how to handle the band at the car factory, etc. So it's both.
But do you think that the manufacturing is a diminishing sector as it comes to labor market? I mean, the number of staff, will that shrink all the time, or
that will continue? But
like agriculture.
No, not to that low level, I would say. But the numbers are exaggerating the deindustrialization because, I mean, we have this outsourcing thing where companies get rid of their, catering and economic services and so on. But there's another thing that we underestimate when we look at the official data, the indirect effects from the service sector that actually delivers directly into the manufacturing sector. If we take account of that, manufacturing industry in Sweden is still some 20 or so percent, and that was 2016. We have had three pretty strong years when it comes to manufacturing production. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that perhaps 22 to 23 or so percent of the economy is still directly and or indirectly related to manufacturing. So this idea of the tradable sector going down and the non-tradable sector expanding, I don't think that's a relevant way to
Goods
look
and
at
services go hand in hand. I think Sarah was first, right? Yeah.
Well, I just had a comment about upskilling that actually we see it in order to recruit young people today. They're smart, so that would be the first question. So we've changed the whole policy, so we have a campus that with ongoing online development for everyone, for all employees, simply because you need that to attract the right new talent. So I think it's also a matter of training people to ask for it, and I'm sure that's going to be a huge competitive advantage for the companies who provide continuous learning and training throughout their job lives, and not sending them away though, but rather do it because that's the beauty of all these online and training system. You don't need to send people away for 6 months or even 2 weeks. So it's becoming increasingly cheap for any company to upgrade the skills, which we have to remember as well.
I know that Karl-Henrik wanted to say something.
No, I just I agree with what Mats is saying. I mean, you talked about the printing machine, but when the steam machine was invented, that was considered to become the end of labor, manual labor. How is this going to work? The fact is, we know it actually increased the opportunities and created more growth. And there are several studies showing that the whole digitalization will probably produce more jobs than you will lose. But the problem is you have to reskill because the new jobs don't necessarily fit the old people, existing people, so you have to upscale them. If I look at what happens on a Volvo assembly line in a truck manufacturing plant, those guys, they are labor, but they are half engineers. That's a serious job they have. So we need systems that support the change, not try to hold back the change.
We would like to open up for a few questions from the audience. Please.
Okay, Carl Kempe again. We had talked about, Mats mentioned actually that we are good at using know-how from other countries. So we don't have to build everything ourselves. And I agree, because I think the competence, Swedish competence, is using know-how, even if we have to have a base know-how also. And I think the question is, how do we build the base know-how both in schools and then all the way up, so that we can utilize the know-how that is now created all over the world and is readily available for anyone.
We will take a second question at once, please.
Right. Ulf Kruse, Chamber Business Networks. Regarding the supply of engineers, when are you prepared to make the engineers heroes of the development? I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, Hans Westberg was here presenting the 5G. It was a picture with two business people standing there, non-engineering behind. So engineers are treated a bit like Sherpas. They bring the white man up to the cliff, and then someone else take the picture, and then they take him down. So when are you prepared to increase the glamour of engineering?
Yes, we have a third question, and then we want to hear the answers, please.
Okay, Håkan Järgels again. Well, Sarah Wall talked about we lack in Sweden the critical mass. I would like to ask the other part of the panel, how do we create that? Is it possible to get the network? Is it possible really to work together in Europe, in EU? Question mark.
Who wants to start? Please, Karl-Henrik.
Yeah, I can say something about, well, first of all, I totally agree. Let's make the right people the heroes. That's for sure. Can EU work together? Well, I think sometimes when we look at EU, we are sort of not too impressed how far EU has come. It's only 25 years old in the present since Maastricht. And I think it's a little bit like when you walk in the mountains, which we Swedes often do. Many of us has done. You see that mountain top and you walk and you walk. It's never gonna come. It's just up there. But then if you from time to time look back and say, Jesus, we've come a long way. And I think if you think about how far, when I was a student in the 70s, I think there was 150 Swedes studying abroad every year. I think today it's about 15,000, plus unofficially maybe just as many more at every given time. If you think about you couldn't leave Sweden with more than, if you wanted to transfer more than 5,000 or 10,000 crowns, you had to get a permission from the central bank. I mean, you couldn't go and work somewhere else. You couldn't quote jobs somewhere else. There's a huge achievements that have been made over these 25 years, but there's a lot left. But I do think that EU is of importance for us if we shouldn't be crushed in this power battle in the world.
Let's just, because we are running out of time, just to give you the last chance, each of you, to give policymakers to come with something that you think is important in order to prepare ourselves for this structural adjustment, which is already going on but might even be larger going forward. So I start with you, Katarina. What would you send to politicians?
Well, first to look over the education system, the higher education, and sort of create a different system with modules that you can work with and digitalize it more also to make it workable when you have a job, so that you don't have to quit to educate yourself. Otherwise, I think the higher education will not be as relevant in the future anymore. You will take other paths to this. And the other, I think, is to the parties also, that we have to learn about these new technologies. For example, on AI, we are thinking about what should our role be when your boss is AI and not a person. How should we regulate that? Maybe, and I think that the model we have in Sweden is better suited for that than actually a regulation decided in the parliament. We can discuss, we can see what works in the ground, so we can have ethical rules, and that creates trust in new technology.
Thank you. Mats?
We have this discussion about the regulation of the labor market, of course. I think we have to do things there, but it's a very broad issue. I mean, Sweden has to be an attractive country for people to stay in. People and companies have to, and that involves a lot of things, taxes and education and a good welfare system and etc. The same factors I think are relevant if we want to attract people and companies to come to Sweden. So we have to think in a very broad sense. It must be attractive for attendants to come here as well. The schools have to be good, because otherwise why should you move to Sweden if your kids don't find a suitable and good education, etc., etc. So I think it's a very good. But we have to be attractive and competitive, and so that's the main thing. We cannot afford to so to speak. We have some disadvantages to start with. It's dark, it's cold. We're away from the markets. We have to compensate for that by being better in other areas.
Thank you. Carl-Henrik, do you have any good advice?
Not any concrete advice here now in a short way, but keep an open mind and educate yourself about what is coming, because it's massive. We have been good in Sweden also. When I was young, we were kind of adventurous. We wanted to travel somewhere. If I could get a job in Brazil for 2 years with ABB, where I started, was much more important than what my salary was. I mean, it was go out there and see. There is a change now. It's hard to get young people to move out. And you have double careers and all those things. And we are even worse in getting those people home that are out there. And in this world that we are heading towards, we need international experience to be blended with our local experience. And we need to understand the magnitude of the change.
Thank you. Sara, last word.
So since I was a bit negative in the beginning, I thought I'll end with a positive one. So what we do have in Sweden, there's this research made by EU across the world in terms of people's perception of new technologies in general, but AI specifically. And it turns out that Swedes are the most positive in the world towards AI. And we're also the country where we're most willing to share our personal data because we trust institutions. Now, this may turn out to be the very core asset we have, the most beautiful starting point for innovation, if we care about it and if we keep it like that. Because even though if the US and China is pushing ahead, they're also pushing privacy, integrity questions quite far. So we may not only have like a salary gap, but a pretty big gap between people who feel extremely worried about their personal safety, their personal integrity, because their data is traded as goods. So I think the one thing that EU has done that's very, very good for us is the GDPR regulation, because that's put us in the forefront in terms of understanding what the borders are. And I think to continue that dialogue about AI ethical guidelines, where should we go? Where do we not want to go? What kind of society do we want to build with these new technologies? If we could be at the forefront of that, and that's a partnership between public and private, that would help a lot, because otherwise I think that backlash can be pretty nasty when people start to feel worried about technology. So that would be my...
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tack så mycket. Tack. 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 Tack, Sara. Then we will have panel 3 coming up, and we will introduce panel 3. So, Johan, you will start.
Those of you who want just very, very short break in order to
just jump up and down.
Stretch a little or something like that. I think you must have this opportunity.
But don't leave the room. You're forbidden to leave the room. No, I'm just kidding.
All right, let's start.
Okay, let's move. So we are starting. You can sit down and we will continue with panel 3. Johan, you will start.
Yes, I will start introducing Martin Flodén, who is Deputy Governor of the Swedish Riksbank with a term of 5 years, and he's on leave as a professor in economics at Stockholm University. He has previously been a member of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, and for a long time he was also an active blogger at the site Ekonomistas.
Yes. Anna Ekström is the Swedish Minister for Education, and she has also been Director General for the National Agency for Education, the chair of the Swedish Confederation of Professional Associations, SACO, and State Secretary in the Ministries of Enterprise and Employment. Thank you for coming.
Yes, and the former member of IVA, don't forget.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Yes, and we have Elisabeth Svantesson, who is the spokesperson for the Moderate Party's economic policy and the second deputy leader of her party. In the previous government, she was a minister for employment, and she has been in parliament since 2006 and is the vice chair of the Standing Committee on Finance.
And we have Harry Flam, who is Professor Emeritus of International Economics at Stockholm University and the chairman of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council. His research has been focused on international trade and European economic integration. He has also been a government investigator of the Riksbank's financial independence. Thank you for coming. So we will start with asking you the same questions of how you see, are you techno-optimists or techno-pessimists? How do you see the structural adjustment coming along? Should I start with you, Anna?
Thank you. Now, for once, I'm at loss for words because I would like to say I'm an incurable techno-optimist. But of course, given evidence, I could change my mind. But I think that this report is really interesting because it, at least to me, it tells me that there is a reason to continue being a techno-optimist, but in order to make sure that your techno-optimism is founded, you have to take very good care of your social security and social policy systems and your education systems, because the proof in the pudding this time is not on techno-optimism really, but on how you arrange a society where people feel secure in change.
So who wants to continue?
Oh, please. Elisabeth Svansson.
I'm a techno-optimist, of course, because Sweden has grown strong of different technological changes, and we can capture technological change. But as Anna said, the minister said, we also had to see that the whole society goes together. So we have an inclusive change in society. And today that looks different than 10 and 20 years ago, but I'm definitely an optimist.
And Harry Flam?
Well, I'm never an optimist, but
I know that.
but I'm quite confident that new technologies will bring us increased productivity and welfare in the future as well as it has in the past.
But you see no problems on the labor market?
Well, of course, there's always displacement of workers. There's always structural change and so forth. But we're used to that, and I don't think there will be any fundamentally different in the future.
I can just agree. So technological change is happening, and it's good. It improves welfare typically, and it makes life more interesting. Of course, it would be extremely boring if it just had stagnation. But if we have very rapid change, that's also, of course, difficult. So we have to be a bit cautious and try to understand what is happening and what are the new risks that develop, and do we have to do something about it. And this, of course, the digitalization, artificial intelligence, big data, etc., it creates new challenges in many areas. But in the end, I'm confident that the sum of all of this will be very good for all of us, or most of us.
How do you deal with this in the Riksbank, technological change? How do you get that into your models? Because it must be quite difficult to...
Yes, and I think it would be too difficult, so we don't try to do it even. So the models is about just understanding the normal things.
Yeah.
And technological change or structural change, we see, of course, that it's happening, but it's not in our core models. We put a lot of effort into trying to understand the structural changes that affect the parts of the economy that is at the core of our activities. And I'm thinking quickly now about what are those changes. Well, it's of course globalization, protectionism, it's aging, it's artificial intelligence, new technologies, etc., that maybe affect financial markets in particular ways. So then the question for us, some of the core questions are, how does this affect the wage and price formation? Do we have to respond with monetary policy or not? That's one of the core questions that we struggle with. And another core question is, why are interest rates so low? And how much of this can we understand when we think about the structural changes that we see, like aging with people saving more, maybe technological change, we would think that it leads to higher productivity growth and higher economic growth, which would lead to higher rates, higher underlying rates, but we haven't seen that. We have seen very slow productivity growth in the data, as several have pointed out, and Professor Roderick in particular. So those are things that we, of course, struggle with, and we are producing a lot of reports about it, but it's not really in the models. You couldn't say that.
But do you look at technological change as a reason for the low wage increases, and which has also been a force behind low inflation and the difficulties for the Riksbank to reach its inflation target?
I wouldn't really say that, but that is one of the big questions, and it's not only affecting the Riksbank, but we've seen similar patterns throughout the world economy, that wage increases have been very slow after the global financial crisis, and productivity increases have been slow. So it's understandable that wage increases have been slow when productivity doesn't increase. But the question is, if technology, if the technology is improving so much, why don't we see more in the productivity numbers? Maybe it is because everything accrues to the top, to the best firms, to the top income earners, etc. I'm not really convinced that that is the case, and in particular not in Sweden. Broadly speaking, we've seen that wage increases have been similar throughout different, for different income groups, etc. in Sweden.
If you look at past technological breakthroughs, they have many times led to financial bubbles and to crashes. Do you see such a risk at the moment? That would it mean that the Riksbank should put more emphasis on financial stability and maybe a little less than a monetary policy, as it seems that that inflation is not a big issue at the moment?
Well, I would say inflation is something that we struggle a lot with, not high inflation, but too low inflation. So it's, that is definitely a concern for us. In principle, we could also adjust our monetary policy to some bubble developments that we are seeing. If we had a broad credit expansion and extremely rapid investment increases, etc. At the moment, I think that risk seems to be very limited or negligible, I would say. So I think the concerns that I would have are more specific and relate to specific markets and need specific attention and specific tools. So we've been talking about the housing market. I think macroprudential policies are better. But going back to Sara Yrbal's question, I don't see her. But one thing she said is that the financial industry is affected rather dramatically by the changes we are seeing with big data, globalization, and it's not only banks, but we are seeing the big tech firms moving into finance. I don't think that we couldn't say that is a bubble, but it creates, I think, big risks in the transformation of the markets that will happen and that will be good and necessary. But it's important that regulators are really following this development and regulate the new parts of this market sufficiently, because financial markets, they are a critical infrastructure and they are not robust without good regulation.
Turning to the political side, do you think, I will raise this question to both of you, Anna and Elisabeth, do you think that politicians should try to foresee these changes to society? I mean, we don't really know how large these adjustments are going to be. Are you prepared to do policy reforms and policy innovation now in order to be prepared for these changes?
Well, I can start by saying a few words on what we normally have done quite well in the Nordic systems and in the Swedish system. And that is trying to create a social policy and education policy where people are given springboards rather than safety nets. That is, when if you look, for instance, at redundancy, being a low-skilled worker or a high-skilled worker with a diminishing job market, this of course feels like a threat. But the more secure you are that you will get the training you need in order to get the next job, what is seen as threat could be seen as even a possibility. And this is an area where we have been quite good in Sweden. We have a good history to look back on. And this is partly thanks to decisions taken in parliament and on government level, but very much due to decisions taken on the social partners level. One of the hidden gems, the hidden treasures of the Swedish and the Nordic model are the foundations created within the framework of collective agreement. Foundations where we call them Trygghetsstiftelsen, Trygghetsrådet. I think there's almost 100 such foundations, almost unknown. There's if you're interested, you can read a very interesting dissertation about this from Gabriella Sebart. This is part of the system we call flexicurity. Sometimes in the Swedish debate we call flexicurity we talk about flexicurity as something we have to import from Denmark. Since I was a member of the Bruegel board when the first flexicurity report was launched, I know that the flexicurity concept is a Nordic concept. It's something we do in the Nordic countries. And it's something we have to keep up and become better at. From a government and parliament point of view, I would say that the most important aspect here is to have a flexible education system. And the more we look at it, the more we see the need of flexible and sometimes rather short courses, but also the need of very basic courses. So we try to invest heavily in adult education for immigrants who have to learn basic skills in order to take the jobs available in the Swedish labor market, but also short courses in order to make sure that there is a possibility for an engineer or an economist or a construction worker or anyone employed in parts of society where rapid change is taking place. So one of the really interesting things where we feel that there is a huge demand and a huge need from the labor market is the higher vocational education, which I feel should be expanded. It will be expanded, but it also will be expanded in a way so that it can reach both low-skilled and high-skilled workers. So what I will try to sort of communicate to you is the real need. If we want to keep a positive view from broad groups in society on technological change, we must work hard together to make sure that technological change is seen as something that could be positive also for me as a person. And I'd like to end by quoting a former leader of the Swedish Metal Union, Göran Johansson. He once said that we should never be afraid of new technique. We should be afraid of old technique. It's the old technique that takes away the jobs for our members. But in order to make that feeling really happen inside everyone, we need to make sure that that we have provisions and ways to take the new jobs.
Thank you. Do you agree, Elisabeth?
I do agree in many things that Minister said, and I would like to add as an answer to your question, that would be terrific if we could foresee exact changes. We are quite inadequate in that when it comes to picking winners, and we shouldn't really do that, and I don't think we are. That doesn't mean that we stand passive or stand by idly. We have to be prepared, and we have to be prepared for when it comes to climate change, economics transformation, change in the labor market. And I think we are pretty good at that in Swedish politics. And we have to be quick to act when changes are very rapidly. And that's the thing. I think we have to have that mindset. And Swedish, I think government and parliament has that. And then we have we can discuss and debate exactly how we should do different things. But in the end, we are quite prepared, I think. And sometimes it takes too long, of course, but I think we are. And the most important thing now, when things actually change more rapidly than before, we have always have technological change and shifts, but it's quite rapidly now, and then we have to be quite quick to act.
May I continue with asking then if you see any need for a change in your policies concerning taxes? Is it still a big need for tax cuts rather than expanding the public sector in parts where there is a demand also from private companies to have more support in different ways from public policies?
Yeah, I still see opportunity for Sweden to have lower taxes. And I see definitely a very need for prioritizing. I think we all should ask ourselves as politicians, especially in government, every morning we wake up and think, okay, what's important for Sweden today? How can we solve the problems we have with shootings and everything like that? But we also need to see 10 and 20 years ahead. What kind of decision do we have to make today that Sweden will be stronger 20, 25, 35, 45. And when it comes to tax reform, I think that would be good to put growth discussion of growth on the agenda, I really would love and like and think it's necessary to have a vital debate in Sweden. How can the cake be bigger? How can we have growth? And that would be good in a tax reform. And I think the taxes, some of them, need to come down, because if we want people to move here, we want people to start companies here, even more than today, we will need a bit lower taxes.
Anna, if I turn to you, if we see that maybe people that are middle-skilled, and we are now sort of challenging the labor market maybe on those income groups as well, do you think that we should change the way we tax labor in relation to taxing capital because of this technological change?
Yes. For the Swedish audience, I can say that inside the January agreement, there are clear provisions that we should work on the tax system in relation to climate change, in relation to taxing finance compared to labor. But I would like to add also that all the when I meet employers, and I meet employers very, very often, I hear very little complaints about high taxation, but I hear lots of complaints about access to skilled workers. The first problem that employers take up with me is always on how to get skilled workers. And the skilled workers they are talking about, it's not only engineers, even though I agree with the gentleman who put the question on making engineers heroes. I've been married to one for 33 years, so I see them as heroes. But not only engineers, not only medical doctors, not only teachers, not only nurses, the professions we read about in the newspaper every day, but also skilled construction workers, assistant nurses. All over you see a shortage, a lack of skilled workers, and this is really putting a brake to growth in Sweden. It's really putting a brake to growing companies. So when I meet employers, at least, but they don't ask me for lower taxes. They ask me for more construction workers and more nurses.
Okay, so but would it mean that you would tax labor about the same as today? Or would you decrease taxes on labor in order to make sure that we have a labor market, and then instead increase labor on capital?
Well, you're asking things of an education minister that you should ask a finance minister, and this is an area where we have an agreement in the January agreement, which is, I think, very good agreement, stating that we should have a shift in the taxation system, where we use more energy to make sure that we use the tax system in order to handle also the climate change issue. But I will say no more about this, because this is, as you know, the area. But what I would like to say is you have to realize that in order to make sure that we have an education system that really provides industry and the public sector with skilled workers, you have to focus on not only quality but also actually quantity in the education system.
But as a Minister of Education, do you feel that you have really an impact when you want to improve the school system? And that is, my question is based on that we have a huge housing segregation, for instance, that we have had a large migration, that we have many social factors that are not easy to control and that we have to deal with, but which means that we have had large problems, and we still have in the school system, that are beyond your power, so to say.
Well, partly beyond my power. Many of them are part of my responsibility, at least. I would say that I was primarily talking about adult education and upper secondary education, but you're coming into what's happening in the we call it grundskola, the mandatory school system in Sweden up to 15 years of age. And this is, of course, also vital for the supply of labor and the supply of talent to the Swedish research and to the Swedish labor market. And we have had huge problems with declining results when it comes to the school system. We know this through the international surveys primarily, but we also know that as we see that results are going up, we can also see that segregation is going up. And I'm personally convinced that a segregated school system that is where we see the level of segregation growing is a big negative for the Swedish supply of labor and the Swedish supply of talents. I'm convinced that we lose talents, and I'm really upset that the Swedish school system does not, to the degree that I would want it to, help every young person to find his true potential, since too much is depending on which parents you're born with and which school you go to. This is due to housing segregation, but it's also due to the way we manage our school system, the way we market orient our school system, and it's maybe an issue for another seminar. Maybe the seminar you went to a few weeks ago where you were the only journalist.
She remembers.
Yeah.
Harry.
Yeah, yes. Now we want to talk about fiscal policy, and in this perspective that we have at the seminar. And to start with the rules that we have a framework where Sweden has a fiscal surplus target of 0.33% of GDP, and many are now requesting to loosen that target because there's such a need that is talked about a lot, about investments in infrastructure, in education and housing, etc. Do you think there is any reason to change the framework in some way, or loosen it up occasionally or more permanently?
I think that you could change the budget target. You could lower the budget target to, say, -1% or so. But I don't think that would make much of a difference to the goals that you have in mind, infrastructure, education, and so forth. I think there is a discussion today in Sweden that since we have such a low debt burden, it's about 35% of GDP, we should spend more on things that we think are necessary. I'm actually older than Lars Calmfors, and I can see that we've basically always thought that there were very urgent investment needs in different areas. And I don't think that the needs are especially urgent today. So I don't think that we should discuss the surplus target in that light. I think it's important to take other in considerations when discussing that. I also want to remind you that we now have a system where the surplus target is going to be reviewed every 8 years. The next time is going to be 2025. And I think that's a very good, orderly system to make changes if those are necessary. You asked about investments in infrastructure and education, and I would like to show you a couple of pictures.
We can allow that, yeah, if you're fast.
I was hoping that you would touch on that. So,
you made a perfect forecast.
See if...
I think you can just go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So just to give you a background of where we stand, this is a picture on research and development intensity in EU member states in 2017. You can see that Sweden is the far left, so we have the highest share of all EU countries. This is a more international picture showing a bunch of other countries at the far right end, but we still compare very favorably to almost every country in the world except South Korea and Japan. This is a picture of the number of patents per 1 million inhabitants in the world. And if you look at the picture, we see that Sweden ranks very favorably. It's only Japan, South Korea, Israel, and Finland that are ahead. So we invest very much in research and development, and we're quite prominent when it comes to patents, at least. This is a picture of our expenditure, government expenditure on education as a percent of GDP. And as you see here, we also compare very favorably. You see Sweden to the far right there. We lead this ranking except for Iceland, but we still come out very, very well in this comparison. You can also see that we spend very much on primary education compared to other countries, and relatively little on higher secondary and higher education. Now, this is a picture of something that Anna touched on. This is the average reading performance in PISA, the international comparison of school attainment, and the average spending per student from the age of 6 to 15. And you can see that Sweden is there. But what's interesting here is that school achievement increases with spending when you have a very low spending on education, primary education. But once you reach a certain level, the regression line here is almost flat, so it doesn't matter much how much you spend, it's how you spend it. This is another similar picture in mathematics achievement. You can see Sweden here too, there. The line is actually sloping down, so you shouldn't spend too much if you want to have high achievement in mathematics. And here is another picture on spending in public infrastructure. And this is the best picture I could get. This is total public investment as percent of GDP, so it's not actually infrastructure. But, as you can see again, excuse me, Sweden is at the top there. It's only Estonia that has more spending as a share of GDP. And finally, I have this picture, which is spending per head on railroad infrastructure. And again, you can see that Sweden compares quite favorably. It's only Switzerland where you know that the trains work like clockwork.
Yes.
And let me finally also show another picture. We've been talking about the productivity slowdown. And this is a table from the Fiscal Policy Council's latest report, where we adjusted GDP per capita for different demographic changes. You can see the development over different decades in Sweden in GDP per capita. And if you take out changes in demographics and changes in the labor market, you can see that labor productivity, there is no very clear trend there. We have quite a low labor productivity in the last few years, but we did have a very low increase in the 80s as well. So what goes for Western Europe and the US doesn't show up as clearly in the Swedish data. Thank you.
Yes, but yes,
Anna wanted to comment. Which
yes,
is,
right.
Can I just comment a little bit on the numbers of spending when it comes to the primary education? And primary, that is, I don't know if you count primary as... is it grundskolan? Then in English it would be primary and lower secondary. If you, those figures look staggering, but if you instead measure the cost we allocate to teaching and students' health, then Sweden is, I think, even maybe below average of OECD. These figures reflect very much that we have a cold climate, we have buildings with high costs, and also, which is never discussed, we have inside the student cost in primary free lunches for everyone, which is internationally rather unusual, cost-free lunches. So if you instead isolate the cost for primary to teaching and student health, you will be on the average. That's but I would also like to say to you, Harry, that when I wanted to sort of invest heavily, that is, I want to invest heavily very much on adult education and upper secondary education, the kinds of what we are discussing here, the kinds of springboards education that we need in order to make society work and in order to make people feel secure and not turn to defeatistic policies. But I would also like to add that what we need, and I think maybe you agree with me on that, we need to make sure that the resources we use for primary go to the pupils that need it most. And there we have a problem in the Swedish system. One of the reasons for the big market-oriented reforms in the 1990s was that we wanted to make the it was said, at least in the proposition made to Parliament, that this would lead to a more cost-efficient school system. And that is one thing that I can safely say that we have not reached that target with the market reforms we did in the 1990s. I leave it up to you to decide whether we met other targets.
Yes. If we listen to Harry, we don't need to invest. We are doing great. But I want to ask Elizabeth, do you agree that we have no need for public investments going forward?
First of all, I would like to say, even though we have fiscal discipline in Sweden and we agree to the budgetary laws and regulations, of course, that doesn't hamper investments, and we need investments, I think, in different sectors. And of course, we also need to be better to see, is every money, is it used well? We discussed that too politicians all look forward, and what do we want to do tomorrow? Maybe we should ask ourselves, what is the result of the policy that we have been up to, of course. Just short comment on, of course, I do agree with the minister that every company I visit to, and I visit a lot, that its competence is the big issue. With that said, I think we'll need lower marginal taxes. We have the highest in the world, and I'm very happy that you bring that now. But competence is the issue, and I think that we need to focus on the educational system. Small children in Sweden, we want them to be in school 1 hour more per day, math and Swedish language, for example. We want to focus, when it comes to higher education, on quality more than quantity. We have had such a focus on quantity in Sweden. That's good. We can all go to higher education, almost. But we need to focus on quality. That's what I think. If we want to be a stronger country in 10 and 20 years, we need to have a more focus on quality than we have before. I'm very determined on that one.
Before we run out of time, we would very much like to open up for questions from the audience, please.
Ulf Kruse, Chamber Business Networks. A question to the politicians. You have very few engineers in the system there, in the political systems. There are 10 in the total parliament, none in the educational board or committee, whatever you call it, and there's one in the government working with equality, so not even involved in education. Do you see that as a problem?
Are you an engineer?
Well,
sorry?
Are you an engineer?
I am.
Why don't you join some party?
It's a two-way street, I understand that. But it's also a question of where do you put the engineers?
Are there more questions? We will sum it up. Please.
Hi, I'm Caroline Valerud, entrepreneur. I wanted to link back to Professor Roderick's talk and ask, he seemed to think it was very natural that we should focus on internal sort of creating equality within our country before bringing in immigrants, for example. Also more potentially trade barriers, etc. And I'd be interested to hear the politicians and other experts' thoughts on that.
I think this gives also a good opportunity for you to sum up, because we're almost running out of time. So please, just what you have learned from this conference, and what do you think that Professor Roderick's ideas, in what way they could be applied in Sweden?
Okay, let me start. First of all, I just use these PowerPoint slides to illustrate the fact that we do invest a lot in Sweden in education, research and development, and infrastructure. I wasn't meaning to criticize the school policy. But I think the one thing that could improve educational results the most, I think, very simple, no cell phones in the classroom. Anyway, that said, I think that Professor Roderick, I think after listening to the discussions today, have heard that he gave a very interesting talk, but it's not so well suited to Sweden, because we've all been saying that Sweden is an exception. So I think you will have a chance to comment on that later. But I do think that the issues that you raised at the beginning of your speech about political polarization, about income divergence, and the remedy that you prescribe, namely to make to adopt a much smarter industrial policy at the production stage. I think that makes most sense in countries that are not as developed as Sweden, in less developing countries or middle-income countries, where you will see that market failures are more prevalent and problems are greater than in Sweden. I think Sweden, in a way, is, I think, more on the line with the model that you would like to see than many other countries. So that's my comment.
Anna.
Please, yes.
Well, thank you. I didn't listen to you, Professor, but I read your slides before coming here, and I drew completely the different, the opposite conclusion, that Sweden is the perfect example of what you're saying. And my absolute conviction, which has been strengthened by reading your paper, is that in order to keep an open economy, open to the world, where we trade with others and where we compete with knowledge and innovation, we must make sure that the Swedish labor market and the Swedish social policy is equitable, and people feel that they have that there is a positive side to globalization. And that's one of the real lessons that you've taught me, and the lessons that the last years have taught me. I've been all my life been very positive towards globalization. But the big message to me is that in order to keep up globalization, we must take care of the social policy and the social the networks, and making sure that we have springboards rather than safety nets for those who are redundant and or are affected. So that's the message that I read into your paper. But as Harry, he was my professor when I went to universities. I would never contradict him in anything, as you have seen.
We've seen that.
and I also feel that the access to education and the to keep up the supply of educated people in Sweden is important. We've been talking about the job market. We've been talking about research. But this is also important from another point of view that you mentioned in your paper, namely that the idea of the school system is also to make sure that we have citizens who can take part in building a cohesive society, who can see the difference between a stated fact and a opinion without ground on the internet, even if it comes from big leaders. So we must make sure that that our education systems also provide us with active citizens, which I think is more important now than ever. And there is a word in German and Swedish that I haven't found in English, and that is the word Bildung, bildning, which I think is more important now than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Elisabeth.
I really appreciated your distinguish, Professor Roderick, between economic and political populism. And of course, I'm not really thinking that we should letting economic populism loose without restraints, but we have to make sure that the transformation is including everyone. I come from a constituency, Örebro län, where we have small cities like Hällefors, Kopparberg, and if you go with me there and sit and drink, take a cup of coffee and talk with the people who lives in Kopparberg, not every one of them feels that they have been gaining of globalization. And on top of that, we have a huge immigration to these small cities, and they are really struggling right now. And I think we need to see that our the economic policy also will gain and include them in different ways. Otherwise, the political populism will be so much bigger, and the tension in society would be very much too much. It means that I should finish, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's difficult to add something here, I guess, and I agree very much with what Harry said. I think, and several have pointed out, that we've seen rather rapid technological change in Sweden before, and Sweden has been a bit special here in the European context, I think, in being very open to structural change, and it has been an outspoken policy even from, or even in particular, I guess, from the trade unions, that we have to welcome structural change. And what was said by the trade unionists about being afraid not of the new technologies but of the old technologies, I think is very important. So I think Professor Roderick's presentation is maybe not particularly well suited to the Swedish context today. I agree today that the big problems and challenges we have is not with the middle income workers or the skilled workers, it's with the immigrants and the very low educators. It's the lower end of the income distribution that is the challenge. We have the very divided labor market. But in the future, who knows if the technological development continues, and it's in particular the middle class or the middle income distribution that is affected, this will of course be very relevant also here. But I think, and that's my main message, it's important that we still maintain this mindset of accepting change and trying to learn to live with it and use it to something good. So that's where I stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tack, tack. Tack, tack.
So we are welcoming Professor Roderick up on stage again for your. Now you have the opportunity to comment on what you have heard, and so please come up, and we'll also perhaps ask you a few questions. But we give the floor to you first, so that you can comment on what you've heard. What do you take with you from this conversation?
Well, thank you. This has been a very, very interesting morning with me, and for me, and I've really learned a lot from these discussions, and both the agreements and disagreements, and some of the cognitive dissonance. I think part of it is that Sweden is indeed a special country, and when I give similar talks in other countries, one way of summarizing what I'm saying is be more like Sweden. And the question then becomes, what do I say when I come to Sweden? I guess one version of what I said is to say, be an even better example of yourself. And I think clearly, Sweden is a country that has a lot of advantages, and we've heard about the social partnership, the social dialogue. The openness to change and how change has been accommodated to date in this country, the extensive social protection that still exists, and all of that is a tremendous base from which to move. Sweden also maybe has some disadvantages that kept coming up. Sweden's a small country in a very big and globalized economy.
and that puts the onus on a somewhat different challenge and onus on large, very competitive, innovative companies, which is on the one hand, they have to be globally competitive, but as they also well realize that you cannot be a very successful Swedish company if Sweden as a whole is also not a successful economy, successful country for the large majority of Swedes, and how to square that circle. I guess my comments and my remarks were premised on the idea that that the challenges of current and future technological change are going to be somewhat more difficult and intense than simply business as usual, or simply just going back to the last 30, 40 years of technological change. You know, in the history of technological change, this idea that everything good went together, that we have technological change, but you know there was employment growth and wage growth also went hand in hand, is partly because we had a process, a very fortunate process of structural change, where as people got displaced by existing technological innovation, there were other kinds of activities in which they moved in, where in fact wages and working conditions were even better. So the first technological transformation was when agriculture became much more productive. People moved into better jobs in the urban areas. When standardized manufacturing became automated, and the factory system, they were moved into better jobs, into higher value added, more skilled production. When deindustrialization set in, there was a process of people, and this is where the problems first started to appear. People moved into higher productivity services where jobs were even more pleasant, and problems began to appear here, because and then we can see the problem in services, because not everybody had that kind of opportunity. Now, a country like Sweden managed this transformation much better from manufacturing to services than Britain or the United States did, where in the United States you had many people who were displaced from manufacturing actually ending up in very low wage paid, precarious service sector jobs, which was even worse than being a production worker in autos or steel. The problem in the next stage of technological change with AI and digital technologies is not entirely clear where these new tasks or new sectors that are going to absorb the people who are going to be potentially displaced. And we heard it here in the Swedish context, not so much from manufacturing anymore, because manufacturing, employment deindustrialization in Sweden has already taken place significantly. But in services, as people are replaced from business services, finance, personal services, and so forth. So where will these people go? That's not entirely clear. And there is going to be, so the premise of my remarks was that even for a country like Sweden, which so far has managed this transition so well, that there is going to be an issue at the sort of the bottom of the labor market, and the challenge of creating good jobs. Whether in the Swedish case we're talking about integrating less educated immigrants into better jobs, or dealing with the specific dualistic aspects of the labor market is at issue. Those would be the Swedish versions of this good jobs problem. Now, I think when we were dealing with the somewhat similar sort of, we're sort of coming to the end of a phase, I think, where we encountered similar problems that globalization created. And I want to take two lessons from that experience, and just to say that, that we should take that to heart when we talk about the issues in the Swedish context or in technology. One mistake I think we did with respect to how we approached globalization was we significantly and systematically underestimated the labor market consequences of that. Again, countries like Sweden and many other European countries that had good social protection systems, I think, were not particularly harmed by that.
But those labor market consequences in places like the United States and Britain were quite significant. The second and more germane, I think, mistake we made was that even when we thought that there might be some labor market consequences, there was a kind of thinking that said, well, this was going to be the job of somebody else. So, economists and banks and trade technocrats and trade lawyers and governments negotiating trade agreements could do all of this and just say that there will be other people taking care of the labor market consequences of this. This is not our job. The safety nets, the compensation, the redistribution, that's somebody else's job. And I think what came out of that is that those other people did not do their jobs. Partly because I think the economics and the politics of the incentives didn't work. But the lesson that I take from this experience that's relevant to how we think about technology and its impact on labor markets in the future is that if we don't integrate our thinking about what the consequences for employment and labor markets is going to be in our discussion of technology innovation per se, and just simply say that that's going to be the job of social protection or the welfare state or the redistribution, we're going to make a similar kind of a mistake, and there's a risk that we're going to be similarly frustrated with some of the outcomes. That means that this separation between innovation policy, growth policy, fiscal policy, sometimes education policy, and with employment and labor market consequences is unlikely to serve us well. So that means that when we're doing innovation policy, when firms are thinking about innovation and new technologies, when we're thinking about labor markets, that thinking will have to be much more integrated in terms of what the implication for the creation, the expansion of good jobs is. And that's largely what I meant by sort of my version of this new industrial policy or this new productivist policy. And we've seen in this discussion that there are many elements of this that already takes place, particularly in terms of labor skilling, vocational education, improving the labor workforce development, that already takes place in the Swedish context. But there's more, and also at the very top level in terms of the social partnership and conversation with big business, that also takes place. But there's a very large middle in between those two that could be filled in. So I think Sweden rightfully developed the Swedish model for which it got the rest of the world's praise, and it became a model for other countries to follow. And that was a model, I think, that was largely based on the success of its welfare state and its social protection. I think we're now moving into a stage where I think the challenge is going to be for Sweden to become a model for the innovation state. And an innovation state that is also equally inclusive. And that, I think, is going to that's going to require much more thinking about sort of how to integrate thinking on innovation with its employment and jobs consequences, rather than sort of bifurcating those problems.
Thank you very much. There is time for a few questions from the audience to Professor Roderick. I would like to start with one question, and then you can sum up your answer to everybody. But Sweden has been very well adapted to a situation with free trade, open markets, and all that we have been leaning on for a long time. But if there would come a more permanent backlash, if there would be much more protectionism in the world, and trade barriers of different kind, in what way do you think we could adapt to that situation? Wouldn't that mean that Sweden has to change a lot compared with where we are now? Well, that was my question. Are there any others? Please.
Hello, my name is Marcus Lackner. I come from the School of Economics and Management in Lund. I think it's important to make an analytical separation between the computerization, the way we have known it since the 1950s, and the kind of digital transformation that we have seen happen the past 10 years with exponential growth of computing powers and so on. So given this background on some of the policy, industrial policy changes that you're proposing, that seems to require quite a bit of political unity On the other hand, you also showed a few PowerPoints on rise of populists and the typical 4-year terms of office that we see in political offices. Is there a potential conflict between what you're asking for and the political landscape the way we see it right now?
Okay, one issue that we did not touch upon has to do with the technological development and competition. Because you can see at most markets, actually, I think, at least some studies for the US and also for some other countries, what we see is that there is an increase in concentration, more dominance of relatively few firms. And for high-income countries, there is also a somewhat worrisome decline when it comes to startups and entrepreneurship, as shown by, for instance, Furham and Peter Orsag for the US, and there are similar studies for other high-income countries. So your views on that would be interesting to hear.
We have one last question up there.
Thank you for a very interesting day, everyone. Henrik Hermansson, Swedish Agency for Growth Policy Analysis. I was wondering whether you could comment, Professor, on the sort of timing aspect of your proposals, in the sense that a downturn is coming, and there's arguments to be made, as has been mentioned, that we should sort of borrow to invest and potentially invest in the way that you're proposing at this particular moment. Could you comment on the sort of timing aspect?
Quite a few questions, but
well, thank you. Big questions. Timing now, but I mean, you know, obviously this is. I think it's more a kind of a change in mental frames that I think has to come first. I think, you know, we need to sort of internalize the challenges that we're facing and start to think whether, in fact, that we may have to approach these problems in a somewhat different way than simply changes at the margin. And then, obviously, you can't do everything all at once. It'll have to be done gradually. But I think the time from that change in mental frames would be now. The question on startups, economic dynamism, competition policy, and interface with innovation and so forth. So on the last, I do think that at the European level that we need to I think sort of competition policy has sort of taken a life of its own, and I think we need to sort of integrate it much more with the kinds of issues that we've been talking about, including, I would say, not just industrial policy. I would be, as you would guess from my remarks, I do think Europe needs an industrial policy, but it's not about just protecting national champions. It's not about just the large firms. It's not just about the French and the German big firms. And it's not just about the firms. It's really about ensuring that they create employment. So that means that you need to integrate competition policy. You need to put it not in a pedestal on its own, but you need to understand that there might be some trade-offs and conflicts with respect to industrial innovation policy and your employment goals. And I think that that means that simple consumer welfare maximization in the short term is not going to be the right social welfare criterion. But let's, of course, by all means not go to sort of just protecting national champions because they're big connected firms. And I think on startups and in general, I mean, we don't quite understand why this is happening, but this is all part of this. I think you also talked about it a lot, is really this problem of dissemination or lack of dissemination of new technologies to smaller firms. And I think, this is, given that process is actually one we know that's rife with market failures, I think it's one where there is a role for government policy. Either to remove existing imperfections in the form of market power,
or to fill in some of the coordination and market failures that prevent some of the dissemination from taking on. So this would be part of this new industrial policy that I was thinking of. I mean, on the political implications of these new digital technologies and what the requirement it makes on sort of political unity, leadership, and a cohesive kind of sense of, strategic. Yes, it is a challenge. Again, I think I would say that Sweden is a country that starts from, relatively strong, advantageous positions of having a relative cohesion. And I think the way that the system has worked so far to keep the Sweden Democrats out of power, I think is a testament to sort of the ability of the mainstream parties to come together. So if there's one country that could do it, maybe it is Sweden. Finally, on trade barriers and protection, I don't foresee a world where there will be trade barriers within Europe. So I think that would be a very big cost for Sweden. I think somebody else mentioned there is a lot of technologically led globalization that's taking place with some production being reshored and so forth. And that sort of will mean that if it's not Sweden, it's the region, it's Europe. So I think, as long as, Sweden's backyard, Europe still remains fairly open to trade. I think, that's sort of most of the cost of, US-China trade wars or protectionist blocs, I think, might be manageable for a country even as small as Sweden.
Thank you very much. Now I will ask Tula to come up, and we have to say thank you to Professor Roderick.
There is a secret place, where we have some presents.
Thank you.
So we want to thank you very much for coming here and for sharing your insights. And I hope that we can continue this discussion over the lunch. But thank you for coming, and thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.
I also want to thank the excellent moderators. Thank you so much. I want to thank the department for organizing this, and all of you who have been contributing to the program. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And there will be a lunch upstairs.